We shall now proceed. The clerk will now proceed to read the orders of the day.
European Union Finance Bill Committee.
Now.
Order.
Hello. Order.
European Union Finance Bill.
We begin with the question at Clause 1, stand part of the bill, with which it will be convenient to debate Amendment 1 to Clause 2. That Clause 2 stand part of the bill and new Clauses 1, 2 and 3. The question is that Clause 1 stand part of the bill. Minister.
Thank you, Mr Streeter. Great pleasure to serve under your chairmanship this afternoon. Since all of the clause stand parts, amendments and new clauses are grouped, if it is convenient, I shall start with the two clauses in the bill, then turn to the new clauses and finish with the amendment, since it's a consequential amendment related to the new clauses. The purpose of this bill is to enable the UK to give effect to the new Own Resources Decision, or ORD for short, amending the arrangements for financing the annual budget of the European Union. These amendments were agreed at the February 2013 European Council, and the new Own Resources Decision reflecting those amendments were adopted by the Council of Ministers on the 26th of May 2014. Clause 1 is fairly simple. It adds the new Own Resources Decision, adopted unanimously in May 2014, to the list of previous Own Resources Decisions recognised under the European Communities Act 1972, thus giving it effect under the UK law. Turning to Clause 2, when passed, the bill will become the European Union Finance Act 2015 and will supersede the European Communities Finance Act 2008, which approved the previous ORD. This clause simply cites this Act as the European Union Finance Act 2015 and repeals the European Communities Finance Act 2008. Now, for the benefit of honourable members, I will explain in a little more detail what the new Own Resources Decision to which this Clause 1 refers actually means. First, the new ORD will largely maintain the existing financing system framework, which consists of 4 pillars. Levies and duties on trade with non-member countries in agricultural goods, including sugar. Customs duties on trade with non-member countries. The yield from applying a call rate to a hypothetical harmonised VAT base for each member state, and a fourth resource based on gross national income, GNI. These 4 pillars remain largely untouched in the new ORD. This is no insignificant achievement. During the negotiations over the Multi-Annual Financial Framework, or MFF, and before, there was considerable pressure to change the financing system.
Would my right honourable friend give way on that?
Certainly give way.
Would my right honourable friend confirm that the GNI is assessed in the same way across the whole community?
Yes, it is. He raises an important point, and he, I suspect, has in mind the issues that occurred last year as a consequence of revisions to our GNI and indeed to other member states' GNI, which meant that there was an additional surcharge, if you like, that applied to the United Kingdom. And he will, of course, recall the negotiations that followed that surcharge and how we ensured that payments were delayed and that the rebate applied to that surcharge. But yes, there is a consistency in terms of the application here, and that, of course, is very important, and there's considerable scrutiny and coordination with Eurostat playing a role in these circumstances. I'll certainly give way to the right honourable member.
The various agreements as a considerable achievement. But under the Pillar 2, in terms of the rural development payments, Scotland's payments are going to work out around €12 per hectare. The EU average is €76 per hectare. Would you care to define considerable achievement in that light?
Well, I would certainly make very clear that there was a considerable achievement in terms of the negotiations that occurred in 2013 and that were implemented in 2014. For example, there were calls for there to be changes to the financing system. There was a call to introduce new types of member state contributions, and the UK resisted that, successfully resisted that. There were calls to introduce new EU-wide taxes, including a financial transactions tax, and the UK resisted that successfully. And finally, there were calls to reform the rebate, and the government protected that. And that is a considerable achievement. Now, in terms of the regional distribution of if I can just make this point, in terms of the regional distribution of cap receipts, it is only fair to point out that payments per hectare are only part of the story. While Scotland receives the lowest payments per hectare, Scottish farmers also receive one of the highest payments per farm in the European Union. On average, Scottish farmers receive just under £26,000 compared to England's £17,000, Wales's £16,000 and £7,000 in Northern Ireland. I hope that provides some clarity to the right honourable member. Let me give way to my honourable friend.
Mr. Chairman, to my honourable friend, with its characteristic understatement, but with the irony that the House of Commons Library published its briefing paper on this bill on the bicentenary of the Battle of Waterloo, it notes that our rebate is not popular with other member states or the Commission. Can I invite my honourable friend to make a very firm commitment to the retention of our rebate, to continue arguing for it, and to ensure that it's not part of any of the renegotiations of our ongoing membership within the community?
No, absolutely, and I'm very keen to make that commitment. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for making that point. Those of us who participated in the equivalent debates after the previous multi-annual financial framework was agreed, and the previous Act that essentially performed the duty that this performed the task that this bill does, will recall in that debate we spent considerable time focusing on the fact that a large part of the rebate had been surrendered by the previous government, and for little or nothing, a promise of reform of common agricultural policy that had not been delivered. And I will give way to the honourable gentleman because I believe, if I remember correctly, he did participate in that debate. Let me give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way and following the point made by the honourable member on the Conservative side. I have said many times in this House and in previous parliaments too that deal done in 2005 was a terrible mistake, and the government has made frequent reference to it. Is it not now appropriate to consider trying to regain what was lost in that deal? And in particular, because our net budget contributions have been rising so strongly in recent years.
Well, I think what I would say, first of all, is to acknowledge the consistency with which the honourable member has approached these issues, and indeed, if I do recall the debates that we had in 2008 and 2009, he expressed very clearly his dissatisfaction with the performance of the government that he supported in terms of the surrendering of part of the rebate. But the other point I would make is that he should not underestimate the achievement that the Prime Minister made in this negotiation when he went to debate these matters and negotiate on these matters. There are a few who believe that he would be able to reduce the overall budget in real terms, and he succeeded in doing that. But what we have today is a debate that is focused not so much on the expenditure side, although I think we will discuss the expenditure side thanks to the helpful amendments. I was going to say probing amendments. We shall see amendments and new clauses provided by the opposition. But when it comes to the revenue side, this also is very important, and it was a considerable success that we were able to resist new types of member states' contributions, new EU-wide taxes, and that we resisted attempts to reform the rebate. And so I think that is of some note. There are some smaller changes to the ORD, and I'll touch upon those at the moment. But first of all, a great pleasure to give way to a fellow Hertfordshire Member of Parliament.
May I congratulate the government on its success in keeping the EU budget down? Could you confirm that the government will continue to keep pressure on the EU to make sure that it continues to live within its means, not just for this budget settlement, but in future budget settlements as well?
Well, let me thank my honourable friend for his intervention. I will certainly make that assurance. Indeed, I'll set out in a little detail as to what we are doing on this field. Of course, I refer to him as a fellow Hertfordshire MP. Of course, at the time, if I remember correctly, he was part of the team in Downing Street and that was involved in the success that was undoubtedly the case. And it is characteristic of my honourable friend's modesty that he didn't draw attention to that point. But I dare say a lot of the credit for this successful negotiation lies in the hands of my honourable friend for Hertfordshire. Mr Streeter, there are some smaller changes to the ORD that affect some member states' contributions and the balance between the pillars of the own resources system. These are somewhat detailed, but I hope it is helpful to the House if I set those out, as it is in essence the heart of the bill in front of us and the clauses which we are debating. In terms of the smaller changes that are made, specifically member states' retention rate for traditional own resources, TOR, which covers member states' collection costs for customs duties, is reduced from 25% to 20%. This change will have no impact on the ultimate cost of the EU budget to the UK on account of the UK rebate. For the period 2014 to 2020, the ORD also reintroduces the reduced rate of call for VAT-based contributions for Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden. Austria will revert from their reduced call rate over the 2007-2013 MFF to a standard call rate of 0.3% over the 2014 to 2020 MFF. I will give away in a moment. The financial benefit of these changes to the UK depends on technical factors. Even so, on current estimates, these changes point to a benefit of approximately £150 million over the course of the MFF. Give way to my friend.
I thank my right honourable friend for giving way. My constituents in Havant are still reeling from Labour's Great Recession. Can my honourable friend assure me that this finance bill won't result in any new taxes or new contributions from the UK?
No, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and now I can certainly make that assurance. And thanks to the negotiations that occurred in 2013 and the success that the Prime Minister achieved, no doubt ably assisted by my honourable friend, the member for Hertfordshire, and others, that certainly is the case. Certainly give way to my friend.
Well, wasn't one of the other substantial achievements of the Prime Minister in those negotiations is actually shifting the debate about the future finances of the European Union onto Britain making a contribution to the competitiveness of the European Union and making sure that where resources are allocated is to do with improving competitiveness for business?
Well, my honourable friend makes a very good point, and he anticipates some comments I will make perhaps later in my remarks relating to how we ensure not just that the money is controlled and indeed reduced, but the money is better spent. And I think there is a criticism that I suspect is shared by all sides of the House, that the money spent by the European Union in its various ways is not as efficient and is not as focused on improving our competitiveness as it might be. And there are some encouraging signs that there is a greater focus on that, and I'll turn to that shortly. Now, Mr. Street, I was running through the various technical changes that are contained within the own resources decision. I've touched upon the changes to the retention rate. Can I also touch on the reductions or the changes that relate to GNI-based contributions? But before I do so, I'll give way to my honourable friend.
I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way for the second time. He's being very, very generous. I think my constituents in North Dorset, and indeed across the whole of the South West, will want to have the confidence that Her Majesty's Government would in no way acquiesce to a change in our rebate as part of any future negotiations. And we all understand that the UK's agreeing to that is contingent upon any changes to the rebate. Could I invite the Minister from the front bench to make that commitment that it is not part of any renegotiation and that that is absolutely off limits, and that this government will always continue to defend our rebate?
Well, again, I'm grateful to my honourable friend, and I do make the assurance that this government will always defend our rebate. Perhaps it might be helpful to the House if I make the point that I think I made at second reading of the scale and the significance of the partial surrender of our rebate by the Labour government. According to the European Commission, disapplication of the UK rebate cost the UK around €9 billion over the previous multi-annual financial framework, so it's over a 7-year period. Thereafter, with the abatement disapplication fully phased in, cost to the UK is around £2 billion a year. And so that is a significant sum of money, given particularly the fiscal circumstances that we continue to face. And that, frankly, I think the question could be asked, what was achieved in return for the surrender of that partial rebate? And I think it's one that we may hear an answer later on in the afternoon, but I've not heard a convincing answer to that question yet. I'll certainly give way to my honourable friend.
Thank the Minister for giving way. The Minister's been well outlining how we currently fund the European Union by Member States making contributions. Some in the European Parliament are arguing that should be replaced by direct taxes levied by the European Union. Would the Minister confirm that the British Government would resist any such move?
Yes, we would resist such a move. I think that would be a fundamental change to the nature of the relationship with the European Union, and one that would be moving in entirely the wrong direction for the United Kingdom. There were calls in these negotiations for such a step to be taken. There were calls, for example, of a financial transaction tax to be introduced to finance EU spending, and we resisted that. The Prime Minister was very clear in ruling that out from any deal. So give way to my honourable friend first.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to my friend for giving way. He talks about the financial transaction tax, but the city is an incredibly important contributor to the UK's economy. It also has a very significant turnover going on within the city. Can the Minister assure us that the government will make sure that no other attack to a different direction will be allowed to be undertaken by the European Union on the city in terms of looking for alternative sources of revenue from what is our, if you like, the jewel in our economic crown?
Yes, I would certainly make that assurance. And again, in terms of the push, there was a strong push for a financial transactions tax. That would have had a particular impact upon the United Kingdom, given that we have the preeminent financial centre not just in the European Union but in the world, and it would have potentially been extremely damaging for the City of London. We resisted that, and that is an approach that we would continue to take. And I think I would make a broader point. I won't go too far down this route, Mr. Streeter, but that it would be more helpful if there was an acceptance within the European Union that the City of London is a jewel in the crown, I think, to use my honourable friend's phrase, but not just for the United Kingdom, but for Europe as a whole, and that we should have the preeminent financial centre in the United Kingdom, and that trying to damage it would be something that would be disadvantageous to all within the European Union. Now, again, if I can return to the detailed points, Mr. Streeter, although I appreciate that there was wider interest in this debate. But, in fact, I apologise, let me before I do. I'll give way to my honourable friend, as I promised I would do.
I'm very grateful for the Minister giving way. And will the Minister welcome the fact that the Office of Budget Responsibility has confirmed that in cash terms the payment from the UK will be the same in 2019-2020 as it is in the 2014-15 financial year, which in real terms means a reduction of 7%. And will the Minister encourage the Government to make sure that my constituents in Edinburgh do not pay a greater proportion of their taxes into an ever-increasing European budget, but seeks reductions of similar scale?
Well, I think my honourable friend is absolutely right in the point that she is making, and it is noticeable that our contributions are now lower than they were in the last year of the previous multi-annual financial framework, and that is not least because of the achievement of the Prime Minister in February 2013. It is the case that, of course, we continue to suffer the unfortunate effects of the previous negotiation, where part of our rebate was lost, and that £2 billion a year, but nonetheless we have made very considerable progress thanks to the steps taken in 2013. Now, for the period 2014 to 2020, the ORD also reintroduces reductions in the GNI-based contributions of the Netherlands and Sweden, and introduces a reduction in these contributions for Denmark. The UK will contribute to these small corrections, but this will largely be offset by changes to other corrections. Lastly, the ORD lays down the own resources ceilings for payments at 1.23% of total member states' GNI and commitments, which is 1.29%, and sets out the method for calculating subsequent changes to these ceilings following the introduction of the European Systems of Accounts 2010, ESA 2010, by all member states. This bill will give UK approval to the new ORD and is the last UK action necessary to deliver the 2013 deal on the budget. Certainly give way to my...
Thank you very much. I admire the level of detail that we're going through in this debate, and we all here we all here find it fascinating, I know. But when I talk to my constituents, they very often say they would like to hear it in details that they perhaps can understand at a sort of household level. I note from the briefing that essentially it is the equivalent to £10 a month that we are paying as a subscription per person. Can my honourable friend confirm that we will do our utmost to talk in language that everyone outside this House can understand, as well as go through the very fine details when it comes to talking about the renegotiation?
I think my honourable friend makes a very good point, and Mr. Street, I do confess I have rather set out some detailed points which I know that honourable members here will be capable of appreciating, but won't necessarily cause great excitement amongst all the many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, who are currently viewing this debate. But I think my honourable friend has put it in very clear language as to the nature of the contributions that we make, and why it is important that we have a government that is determined to ensure that we get a good deal within the European Union and careful in terms of how we spend money there.
Thank you. I'm very grateful to my honourable friend for giving way. I note, again, a matter that's of great interest to the electors of Tunbridge, Edenbridge and Malling, is that the budget's going to be 7% lower in real terms by 2020, and this is clearly very welcome. But can the Minister say just a little bit more, if I may, on what the consequences will be to the EU budget of the UK's position? Because we're rather hoping that 7% is the beginning, not the end.
Well, it's let me thank my honourable friend for his intervention, and it touches upon the point raised by my honourable friend, the member for Edisbury, and where she drew attention to the fact that our net contributions were lower, or forecast to be lower in 2019-20 compared to 2013-14. In fact, our net contribution in 2019-20 will be £9.3 billion compared to £10.2 billion in 2013-14, which will be low in both cash and clearly and in real terms. So let me just complete my response to the first intervention before taking a further intervention from the right honourable gentleman. But the point that is made by my honourable friend in terms of ensuring that there is a strong case made for budget discipline, for ensuring that it is appreciated that we are dealing with taxpayers' money, and whether that is UK taxpayers' money or from the wider European Union, that money has to be spent wisely, is a very good one, and I will turn to that point later when we deal with the amendments and new clauses provided by the party opposite. Let me give way to the right honourable gentleman, who I see has made more contributions than anybody else, I think, in this House, with bar a handful of senior ministers. So let me give way to him.
I'm pleased to say that I've drawn level with the Chancellor on this morning's assessment, but I do admire the dead bat that the Minister is showing to his back benches. But can he answer the point? Is it the Prime Minister's objective in the European renegotiations to lower the UK's budget contribution? And if so, by how much? Well, the Right Honourable General refers to dead bat. I thought it was a flourishing cover drive, but there we go. What I would say to the right honourable gentleman is that the Prime Minister has set out objectives for a renegotiation that will then be taken to the British people to decide about our future as members of the European Union. There are a wide range of things that we believe we should do in terms of ensuring that Europe works better for its members. But I would make this point is that we have consistently argued the case for fiscal discipline. We are not alone in making that case. Indeed, the very bill that we are debating in front of us today demonstrates that there is strong support for a fiscal disciplinarian approach, if you like, within the European Union. The fact that we were able to negotiate a reduction in the MFF was a considerable achievement, and we had in those negotiations the support of member states such as Germany, such as France, such as Sweden, the Netherlands, and Denmark, and others. So I would make that point. Let me give way to my honourable friend again.
I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. My honourable friend, the member for North Dorset, raised a very important point about protecting the UK's rebate, which is an issue important to my constituents in Havant and also across the country. Can the Minister confirm how much of the UK rebate the last Labour government actually gave away?
Well, certainly I'd make that point. Over the previous MFF period, it was estimated by the European Commission to be the value of €9 billion. And in terms of this MFF period, it is in the region of £2 billion a year, a considerable loss. So that is something that this government will not be repeating. Certainly give way.
I'd like to take the Minister back to the point, the intervention of the Honourable Member for Gordon, because I think he didn't really answer him. There was an article in the Sunday Times this week which made the point that one MP, one of his own side, said about the Prime Minister's intentions, keeping things up his sleeve. He'll try to negotiate a lower net contribution to the budget. That is definitely being said as something that the Prime Minister is holding in reserve. Would he like to comment on that?
Well, the point I would make is that we have consistently argued the case for money being spent more wisely and there being greater restraint in terms of public spending by the European Union. That is an argument where we have already made progress. We made progress in 2013. Indeed, we're implementing a bill that relates to the negotiation, although this is, as I say, on the revenue rather than the expenditure side. And we will consistently argue that case. I'll give way to my honourable friend.
So I'm very grateful to the Minister who's giving a lot of his time. He talks about fiscal prudence and actually spending taxpayers' money wisely. And two of the things that really sort of epitomise, if you like, the wastefulness of the European Union is, first of all, the Strasbourg circus, of wasting money moving the whole of the Parliament to Strasbourg, and secondly, the fact that the accounts haven't been signed off for some 2 decades. But does my right honourable friend agree that whilst the Prime Minister is working very hard in order to achieve this, actually the mood around the whole of the European Union is also behind the Prime Minister in order to try to deal with this? This is not a problem which is just unique in the UK. The Prime Minister has the wind in his sails and support from the rest of the European Union to deal with these problems.
Yes, I think my honourable friend makes an important point. And indeed, I would perhaps go further. It's not just member states who recognise that things do need to change, that there needs to be better value for money. And we will, and I'll touch upon this, but I think certainly Vice President Georgieva, who has responsibility for the budget, recognises the need to ensure that money is spent in a better way. And I'll touch on some of the points here. But I think, in terms of what the Prime Minister is setting out, and has set out consistently, there are two sensible objectives: to cut the whole budget and to protect the rebate, and we will continue to make that case. Now, I was just going to, of course, give way to my.
I thank the Minister for giving way once again. His honourable friend, now not in his place, made a very useful point about expressing our contributions in terms that the citizens will understand, per head, per month, whatever. But also, would it not be useful to look at the expenditure side, say, for example, the Common Agricultural Policy, how much that costs in net terms per head of population, and how much it has cost over many decades in higher food prices? I think people would be very interested to know that.
Well, the honourable gentleman draws me into deeper waters and wider issues, and perhaps I should resist, Mr. Streeter, before you advise me otherwise, not to spend too much time on the Common Agricultural Policy and some of the costs there, although it is worth pointing out that the Common Agricultural Policy, as a proportion of expenditure by the European Union, is falling and has fallen fairly significantly as a proportion. Can I also just pick up the point he makes about making these things clearer and ensuring that the British public have a better understanding of where their money is spent? Of course, there is a wider point there. This doesn't just apply with the European Union contributions, and I'm sure that he, as with all members of the House, would welcome the fact that HMRC now sends out tax statements to the British public so they can see details of where money is spent in various government departments, but also setting out details of money that is spent, our net contribution to the European Union. I just wanted to say a quick word about how the fact that the scrutiny committees of both houses closely scrutinised and cleared the proposal for the new ORD, which was agreed unanimously by Member States in May 2014. The bill and the Prime Minister's 2013 deal demonstrate that working with allies, we can achieve change in Europe and secure a good deal for the UK and a good deal for Europe. And I commend to the House these clauses and that they stand part of the bill. Now, Mr. Streeter, I would... I will certainly give way before I turn to the new clauses before us.
Yes, well, I'd be happy to wait until if he wishes to deal with the new clauses, and I'll come back at that point.
I'm grateful to my right honourable friend, and I'll let me turn to those new clauses 1, 2 and 3, and the additional amendment, all tabled by the honourable member for Worsley and Eccles South. These new clauses would require the Treasury to undertake a series of actions prior to the Act coming into force. New Clause 1 requires the Treasury to inform both Houses that it has formally requested a review by the European Commission into alternative ways of running the EU budget and a comparative analysis of commitments and payments as the basis for appropriations for the budget. New Clause 2 requires the Treasury to request a fundamental review by the Council of Ministers of EU budget priorities, waste and inefficiency. New Clause 3 asks for the Chancellor to issue an invitation to the Commission to provide further details of the draft budget to scrutiny committees. The final amendment, deleting Clause 2, subsection 3, means that the Act would not come into force until 14 days after the conditions specified in each new clause is met. We recognise the concerns underlying the honourable member's proposed amendments. Nevertheless, the honourable member will recall that the bill before us relates exclusively to the financing of the EU budget, and the proposed amendments relate to the separate, though equally important, issue of EU budget expenditure. And on this, I will note, and on this basis alone, we would propose to reject these proposed new clauses.
Forgive me, my honourable friend recognised that while he talks very clearly about the financing and the details that we've been hearing on various percentages going up, various percentages going down, what he's really talking about here is setting the tone on the agreement that we have in the European Union and setting the tone that the UK can play its part, yes, as a good partner in the European Union, but also that the European Union can help to play its own role in promoting what we all recognise is a growing economy in Europe and not just a redistribution of wealth.
Well, I'm grateful to my honourable friend here, and I would say to him that, again, coming back to the deal that the Prime Minister reached in February 2013, it was clearly a success. Clearly our negotiating objectives were met, and I'm sure that he and most of us would hope and expect that such similar success may be achieved over the months ahead. Sorry, you were.
I just invite the Minister to remind himself of the new clause which was moved on the similar debate to this in January 2008, when he and his then Shadow Treasury friends, the honourable members, put forward a very strikingly similar clause which asked for a report on the review by the European Commission covering all aspects of EU spending. Really quite similar, and there was a very robust debate on that day, and he was a signatory to that new clause. So he uses reasons to reject our new clause today, but indeed that was a very similar clause he moved in 2008.
Well, I'm quite tempted, therefore, to point to the remarks that were made by her party colleagues setting out the reasons why that clause should be rejected. Now, she might not have been persuaded by them, but I'm tempted to say that 6 years on, after much reflection, I can see some value. But I think the stronger argument, perhaps I would make, is that in contrast to what happened some years ago, where the previous Labour government had negotiated away part of our rebate, we have just had a successful negotiation in 2013. And let me also, in my remarks, set out the progress that is being made in terms of this agenda. So if I may, I'll respond with a little detail in terms of the substance, putting aside the point that this is a bill that is focused on the revenue side rather than the expenditure side. But before I do so, I'll give way to my right honourable friend.
I'm most grateful. Just on this question of the references in the new clause to the question of the relevant European Affairs Select Committee in each House of Parliament. It is a fact, as I know my honourable friend knows, that the European Scrutiny Committee always goes through all the budgets, makes reports regularly, in addition to which has the power to invite anybody if it chooses to do so, including officials from the European Commission. And in addition to that, also receives explanatory memoranda from the government, in fact from himself. So I'd like to make some further remarks about that later, but frankly I agree very much with what he says in rejecting the proposals of the opposition benches.
Well, I'm very grateful to my right honourable friend for those remarks. And let me come straight to new clause 3, as he has raised this point, Mr. Streeter. With regard to new clause 3, we, along with many across Europe, share the concern that lies behind the honourable member's proposed amendment that the EU is not sufficiently accountable to EU citizens. Honourable members will need no reminding that the Prime Minister has already made it clear that strengthening the role of national parliaments is a central tenet of his reform programme. Within the existing legal framework, the government already takes the role of national parliaments in scrutinising EU proposals very seriously. This is why, when the European Parliament requested the formation of a high-level group on own resources to review the EU financing system, we insisted that national parliaments, as well as the European institutions, were given a voice as part of this consultation. We therefore amended the joint declaration on the formation of the group to explicitly take account of input from national parliaments. We also do all we can to ensure transparent and effective scrutiny of each year's annual budget negotiations. An explanatory memorandum is deposited as soon as possible after the publication of the draft EU budget each year. This is followed by debates in both houses and regular ministerial updates at significant stages of the negotiation process. We are committed to working with both scrutiny committees to make this process as efficient and effective as possible for all parties. But I would say that requiring the government to write to invited officials to appear before the scrutiny committees would, we believe, add little to the scrutiny process and would be a very peculiar precedent for the reasons that my right honourable friend, Member for Stone, points out. It would add little because the committees can and have invited officials to appear before them already. For example, in June 2014, Nadia Calvino, Director General, DG of the Budget, gave evidence to the Lord's Economic and Financial Affairs Subcommittee, and it really should not be the place of government to determine who the scrutiny committee should see. It is for the committees of both houses to decide for themselves who should appear before them and when. It would be a peculiar precedent for the executive to begin to interfere with this freedom, no matter how benign the initial intention. Give way.
I thank the Minister for giving way, and I appreciate the point made by the Chairman of the Select Committee, but the Minister can't have it both ways. In October 2012, in the debate we had, his friend, the Right Honourable Member for Tunbridge Wells, who was taking that debate at the time, complained very strongly to the House, and I referred to this in the last debate, that ministers had asked the Commission to model cuts of €5 billion, €10 billion and €15 billion on staffing costs, a very reasonable request. And that request had just been bounced back with a very insulting comment. We declined this. It's a lot of work and a waste of time for our staff who are busy with more urgent matters. We are better educated than national civil servants. We are high flyers, not burger flippers. That's what the response to his right honourable friend was. If he's expecting us to believe in this debate here that requests like that, a simple request on a staffing issue, is not taken seriously, then I think we actually have got some points to make.
I'll turn to that point. My remarks, where she intervened, were in respect of new clause 3, which is to do with the scrutiny committee, and I've been very clear that I think it would be a curious thing to do to place this in legislation and for the executive to take that role upon itself. And I'm very much echo the remarks made by my right honourable friend with regard to this, and I'll certainly give way.
Just to add one further point before I get on to it in substance, but it is this. that, of course, the European Scrutiny Committee, in its most recent report, which is, in this respect has been accepted by the government, has recommended that each committee, including the Treasury Select Committee, would establish a rapporteur for considering these questions, so we could effectively work with the Treasury Select Committee in order to ensure, if there was any need to do so, that there would be an even deeper examination of the Treasury aspects of this.
Well, I think what I'd say to my right honourable friend is that we obviously welcome scrutiny in this area, and if there are circumstances where the European Scrutiny Committee or indeed other committees of this House seek the government's support in, for example, bringing over Commission officials to give evidence, the government, of course, would gladly support them. So let me offer that hand of cooperation, if I may, but I don't see that the case is very strong for this to be placed within legislation. Indeed, I would go further and say it would be inappropriate for us to do so. Now, that's new clause 3. Now, in terms of what is proposed here, we do not believe that the effect of the clauses, which would require the government to write to various European institutions to invite them to undertake a review of one or other aspect of the EU budget, would really add to the work that the government has undertaken and continues to undertake to improve the expenditure of the EU budget. Now,
will my right honourable friend give way?
Certainly give way tomorrow.
Thank you. My honourable friend, the member for Tunbridge, Morning and Edenbridge, quite rightly highlighted the very welcome reduction in the contribution that is good news for my constituents in Charnwood as it is for his, and in stark contrast to the results achieved in negotiations by previous governments. But as the Minister and my honourable friend for Wyre Forest have touched upon, while the focus may be on revenue, not expenditure, it's important that money is well spent. Would my right honourable friend reassure me he will continue to push the case for reform in the way that the EU spends money to ensure it is well spent, well audited, and that the accounts are actually signed off?
Well, let me thank my honourable friend for an excellent intervention. Indeed, the answer to his question, I think, lies at the heart of our response to new clause 1. And I think he raises a very important point. New clause 1 requires the government to write to the Commission to review the basis of appropriations for the EU budget to see whether alternative arrangements would give better value for money. While the link between appropriations and value for money is an important one, it's not of the first order. The government's first priority is to control spending directly and not through the system of appropriations. Cutting low-value expenditure is the first and most important way of improving the quality of EU spending. In delivering historic real terms cut to the budget, the government took a decisive step. Within a smaller budget, we also made sure that expenditure was reorientated towards areas which provide higher value for money. As a proportion of the total budget, spending on the CAP will fall considerably, while spending on research and development and other pro-growth investment will increase. So it is possible, Mr. Streeter, to operate within the system of appropriations if appropriate control is in place. The amendment nonetheless raises the question of whether the system of payments and commitments is an appropriate one for delivering value for money. And it is a question we must ask. It is true, it is an unusual budgeting system. It is not the way in which the UK government budgets. And if the EU were starting from scratch, we would not advocate using this system. And yet I do not think anything would be gained from requesting a review of the system for one simple and compelling reason. Mr. Streeter, the review that the Honourable Member proposes in new Clause 1 has already been set in motion by the new Budget Commissioner, Vice President Georgieva, through her recent Budget for Results initiative. We cannot obviously say what that review will conclude, but its terms of reference are drawn widely, providing ample space to review the current budget system, including the system of appropriations, and explore possible alternative approaches that would offer better value for money and improved financial management. If I could just make this point, I'll certainly give way to the honourable member. The UK has publicly welcomed that initiative and has shared its expertise. The Chancellor has made it very clear to other finance ministers during meetings of ECOFIN that this is the UK's position, and the initiative will involve Member States, the European Parliament and the European Court of Auditors. Certainly give way.
Thank you, Mr Streeter. I'm grateful for that update, but perhaps he can tell us what the government will be doing proactively in terms of its own priorities to deliver the value for money that he's talked about, beyond the generalities that we've heard all morning around better value for money, better spending, better priorities. Can we have some specifics and how the government is going to exert real influence on this important review?
Minister. Well, the most important point we can do is we can reduce the EU budget, because that's what then focuses the mind of the European institutions to ensure that the money that they are able to spend is prioritised in the right way. And, I come back to the way in which money is spent, greater focus on items that help ensure a more dynamic European economy, greater focus on research and development, for example, and less expenditure as a proportion on the common agricultural policy. It's something that I think that all sides of the House should support, so that is something that has been achieved. I'll give my way to the honourable member.
I think he's answered my question, to be fair. It was about the common agricultural policy and he just walked into the answer.
Well, I walked into I ran with enthusiasm into the answer. I'm glad I anticipated the point he was going to raise. I'll give way.
I'd like to thank the Minister for being so generous and giving way for a second time to me. In terms of this amendment, would you agree that the European Commission, which was the group that actually didn't propose a single euro of savings when this negotiations first started, it would be somewhat strange to then ask them to conduct the review of better value for money as this amendment demands? In essence, it would be asking the poacher to review how their poaching is getting on.
Well, I take the point that my honourable friend makes, but what I would say is that we are, I hope, moving in the right direction. And I would say the early signs, and I'll come back to this in a moment or so, is that the new commission that has been in place for the last few months or so do appear to be more focused on this. I think there is a link with the fact that there was a reduction in the EU budget, and that has somewhat focused the mind. Now, let me turn to new clause 2, which imposes a... certainly give way to the honourable gentleman.
I thank the Honourable Minister for giving me. Following what his honourable friend has just said, would it not be sensible and appropriate for the government, our government, to do a comprehensive review of what we think how the budget ought to operate, and make that as a firm public submission to whatever the European Union undertakes itself?
Well, I'm grateful to the honourable gentleman for his intervention, and he makes it in a characteristically constructive way. I think that clearly it is important for us to work with other like-minded member states to ensure that we get the focus that we need, and that the expenditure is prioritised in the areas that add the most value. And there are clearly different ways in which that could be done, and we could have a discussion about that. But I think it is only fair to note that there has been some progress made here, and I'll touch upon that in a moment. But let me just say this about new clause 2, which imposes a requirement on the government to request a review by the Council of Ministers of the EU budget priorities, waste and inefficiency in advance of ratification. This clause, as new clause 2, relates not to financing but to expenditure, so again I'd make the point that we would reject it. Moreover, while the government recognises... can I just make this point, and I'll certainly give way to the honourable gentleman. Moreover, while the government recognises the need to cut down on wasteful spending, requiring the government to write and ask for a review into waste and inefficiency adds little to what the government is doing in this area. We know that there is waste and inefficiency in the EU budget. We need action, not words, and action is what the government has taken. The most important step that the government has taken has been to cut the EU budget. Just as governments across Europe are making tough decisions to consolidate public finances, The MFF deal negotiated by the Prime Minister has forced the EU to make tough decisions and bear down on waste and economise. Well, let me just make this point. I will give way to the Honourable Gentleman first, as I promised to do. By imposing restraint on the EU budget, we want there to be a culture change in the Commission. The days of the Commission officials measuring their success by how much of the budget they have been able to spend should be behind us. Let me give way to the Honourable Gentleman now.
Thank you, Chair. I'm grateful to the Minister for giving way. I can understand the reluctance to see these amendments incorporated into legislation if they don't deal strictly with the narrow interpretation of what this particular bill is about. Looking at what the amendments are asking the government to do, I can't see any reason why the government would be reluctant to undertake any of those actions. If that's the case, why doesn't the government just give an undertaking to the House today to undertake those actions, and then we don't need the amendments and we can all agree on something?
Move on.
Well, the point I would make in terms of, first of all, in terms of new clause 2, which is how we deal with this issue and how the Council of Ministers works, is that we are making progress. We are delivering the actions here, including cutting the budget. When it comes to new clause 1, we don't need to write a letter on this. I don't need to undertake to write a letter to call on the Commission doing something it is already doing. And when it comes to new clause 3, as I've already made clear, I don't think it would be appropriate for us to be imposing upon European scrutiny committees what is a matter for them. I'll certainly give way to the honourable member.
I'm slightly surprised, thank you. I'm slightly surprised that the Minister can't take on board what's actually a very sensible suggestion there. Because, two things I'd say. One is, I take him back to the point, he says that overall budget restraint is sufficient and there doesn't need to be a focus on waste and inefficiency. But when his colleague, as I mentioned earlier, back in 2012, tried to put forward measures to reduce the staffing budget and ask for modelling, that request was just rejected. If Commission representatives feel that they can just bounce back to government ministers from the UK, simple requests for modelling which really would help make decisions. Members opposite members throughout the House raise time and time again issues they've got with the staffing costs of the Commission. And I think if that's the response that he's getting, he's not admitting it today, but that his colleague put that forward in debate here, then I think, we really have got to press on this. It isn't going to be good enough in terms of this debate to just accept that everything is fine and we don't have a problem. We have to really push the case for enhanced scrutiny.
Well, the point I would make is that we care a great deal about eliminating waste and inefficiency within the EU budget. The question is, how do we do that? The first point to make is that if we can reduce the MFF, that places much greater onus upon the Commission to eliminate wasteful expenditure. She raises a point, and it's a perfectly fair point to raise, that dates back from 2012. The point I would make is that the negotiation triumph that the Prime Minister had in 2013 has reduced the MFF, and we are now seeing signs from the Commission that, frankly, we weren't seeing 3 years ago. Of a much greater focus on this. And let me just quote Vice President Georgieva on the 2015 budget, which was agreed last December. She referred to this being a budget of responsibility, a tight budget that reflects the tight fiscal conditions in our member states. She referred to it as a very focused budget, focused on the priorities that we have established in the new Commission. It is directed towards investments in competitiveness, for instance, supporting the innovative nature of our business. And she went on to say it is also a budget where tight controls on spending will allow us to achieve the best possible results. So I will give way, but the point here, and I'll go on to elaborate upon this, is that Vice President Georgieva's Budget for Results initiative, with its focus on better rather than more spending, has come as a direct result of the imposition of restraint at the top. The UK is engaging constructively with the initiative and is actively working with the Commission to ensure momentum is maintained through regular meetings at political and technical level. And we are working with our allies to increase support for the initiative and to ensure that all member states are represented in discussions. We look forward to the first meeting of the Interinstitutional Working Group in mid-July and contributing to the Budget for Results Conference in September this year. The point I would make is that because of what we have achieved in reducing the budget, we are seeing a culture change. We need to ensure that that momentum is maintained. If the party opposite are supporting that, I'm delighted to hear it. But we have to remember it was the party opposite that surrendered a part of our rebate and failed to impose the discipline that we needed. I'll first of all go to the front bench and then her colleague.
Well, I'm surprised again at the Minister's response on this, and I would remind him that what strengthened the Prime Minister's hand, it's the point I made to him in the second reading debate, what strengthened the Minister's hand was when this side, voting with rebels on his side, strengthened the Prime Minister's hands before he went into negotiations by insisting that the MFF was cut, and I think he really ought to acknowledge that. Surely it helps on every occasion if this House can be strong in saying on all sides of the House that we want enhanced scrutiny, and that's what we're trying to do with the new clauses today.
Well, again, I cannot but throw back the record of the previous government, previous Labour government, in this area. Certainly give way to Ron Front.
It's very difficult to listen to new Clause 2 without remembering that when they were in government in the UK, let's not forget the huge expansion in the number of people employed in government, outreach workers, non-jobs, the vast inefficiency and waste of all those years. It seems a bit rich to be taking lectures on that.
Well, it's a very good point my honourable friend makes, and again, Mr. Streeter, you wouldn't wish me to be detained too long about the fact that various candidates for the leadership of the Labour Party appear to be recognising that too much money was spent prior to the crash, and not all of that money was spent in an efficient manner. And I certainly give way to the member who may agree with that view.
Does the Minister believe that enough is being done to ensure the transparency of budget decisions taken at the EU level?
Well, look, I think there's a good point that the honourable member makes. And in terms of the review that the Commission is undertaking and the focus on a budget for results, I think there's an important point about transparency. Our record as a government is very clear. We want greater transparency in all expenditure, whether it be at a UK or an EU level. So I think there is more that can be done. Can I just also pick up this point about administrative expenditure, which is an important point that was made by the honourable member for Worsley. Which was that as part of the MFF deal, there was a freeze to EU staff salaries in 2013-2014, a commitment by EU institutions to a 5% headcount reduction by 2017, and an increase to the statutory pension age to 66 for officials starting work in or after 2014. Now, I would be the first to accept that these reforms do not go far enough. But working with like-minded member states, the government will continue to push the EU institutions to show maximum restraint when it comes to administrative expenditure. Yeah, certainly.
Can he tell us, given that, is he and our other ministers having more success than his right honourable friend had back in 2012 when they dismissed his very reasonable request to do some modelling on staffing costs? Are the representatives of the European Commission actually being more helpful these days?
Well, there is some progress that's been made since then. The Commission has improved its transparency record. Thanks to the government's ongoing work, amongst other reasons. In particular, it released a payments plan with much greater detail on payment forecasts. But I accept that there is further we can go, and UK citizens expect more. However, making the government right to invite officials to attend committees will not really deliver that. But this will require constant vigilance and discipline. And we have shown that, and it is delivering results. Certainly give way to my right friend.
A question that the member for Worsley raised regarding the question of how the proposals for reduction in the budget actually took place. I'm glad to be able to inform the Minister. I'm sure he remembers only too well. I was one of those so-called rebels. Actually, we weren't really rebels at all. All we were doing was asking the government to listen. And that's exactly what happened. And the result is that we got our amendments. The then Financial Secretary to the Treasury, or Economic Secretary to the Treasury, paid tribute to us for having come forward with these proposals, and everything was absolutely hunky-dory.
Well, I'm grateful for the constructive tone that my honourable friend brings to these debates, and has a history of so doing. And I think it is worth making the point that the desire to ensure that there is greater efficiency in expenditure by the European Union and greater transparency is a point that he has argued for over many years, and I'm grateful to him for that. I should also make the point we are providing technical assistance to the Commission as it considers all the options for enhancing the performance on the budget, sharing our expertise in areas such as value for money, spending area objectives and improving budgetary performance, for example, by removing adverse incentives and improving accountability and transparency.
Will the Minister give way?
Certainly give way to him.
Thank my honourable friend for giving way. My constituents of Thornbury and Yate were aghast when the previous Labour government gave away our rebate. Can the Minister confirm that this bill will ensure that we will have no such concessions as long as this party is in power?
No, I am more than happy to make that assurance to my honourable friend, and it is worth bearing in mind that when we have these debates over scrutiny of expenditure and so on, that by allowing us to make a bigger contribution than we otherwise would, not only does that mean that there is a cost for the UK taxpayer, but the fact that budgets were allowed to increase so significantly also means that the focus on getting value for money with the money that is spent can be lost. So it is important that if we want to eliminate wasteful expenditure, we bear down on the overall budget, because that does have a big impact. And I think that's a clear area where there is a difference, if I may put it this way, between the two parties in our consistent focus on controlling expenditure, whether that be at the UK or the EU level. Now, the next opportunity to look wholesale at the priorities of the EU budget will be the mid-term review of the MFF. This is a review required under the agreement reached on the MFF and must take place by 2016. So again, the opposition's calls for a review appear to add little to the reviews already planned. The government will engage constructively with the Commission, the Council and the European Parliament to look at further ways in which spending can be improved. In the meantime, the government takes every opportunity to bear down on wasteful spending and highlight it where identified. That is reflected in our having voted against the discharge or approval of the EU budget for the past 4 years. Until the European Court of Auditors is able to give a positive statement of assurance for the EU accounts, working with allies, we will continue to call on the Commission to do better. I note this position is not the one that the previous Labour government took. Together with our allies, Sweden and the Netherlands, we have issued a joint counter-statement calling on the Commission and Member States to take proactive steps to reduce the level of error in EU accounts by simplifying regulatory frameworks and increasing the training and guidance available to national officials. By supporting the ECA's calls for more focus on performance and added value in the EU budget, we have helped to change the Commission's focus from compliance to results. The government is also playing its part in work being undertaken to simplify the rules governing the implementation of structural funds. In the past, too often the Commission's focus has been on compliance, fostering a tick-box culture with little care for performance. A structural funds simplification agenda was launched earlier this month by Commissioner Cretu and will meet for the first time next month. As for the Budget for Results initiative, which I've already referred to, this will provide another valuable opportunity for this government to continue to insist on maximum efficiency and results when it comes to EU spending. Of course, we are also keeping up the pressure on the Commission in annual budget negotiations and in response to in-year requests for more funding. We have a strong track record of pushing back against draft amending budgets to ensure value for money criteria are met, and regularly challenge the Commission to identify opportunities for reallocation rather than coming to Member States with requests for more money. The Government is constructively engaging with the work I have outlined in order to ensure the best possible deal for the United Kingdom. Certainly give way to my right honourable friend.
The Minister for giving way. And has he seen the work of the so-called 5 presidents of the euro area, setting out how they wish now to press for full fiscal union with a euro treasury and a euro budget under central control? And can he assure the House that we will have nothing to do with any of that?
Yes, I think the important point my right honourable friend makes there is in terms of for the euro area. And he, I no doubt, will have heard the speech delivered by our right honourable friend, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, at the Mansion House a couple of weeks ago, where he made it clear that one of our priorities in terms of the negotiations for the UK and in advance of any referendum is ensuring that the euro outs, those member states of the European Union who are not within the Eurozone, are properly protected and do not find themselves disadvantaged by the Eurozone countries being able to work together to the disadvantage of those euro outs. So it is an important point to make and a real priority for the United Kingdom.
I'm sure my honourable friend appreciates the difficulties inherent in what is being said, because it is one thing to want to disaggregate the Eurozone from the non-Euro member states, but the reality is that they are all part of the same European Union, and any attempt to make a change of this kind would indeed be a fundamental change in our relationship with the EU, and would require treaty change by any reasonable standards. Does he appreciate how serious the position is if in fact we don't either seek or necessarily achieve that objective?
Well, I think what my right honourable friend is saying, and is making a very important point, is that it is important that we do meet that objective. And in terms of the report that has been published, I would make this point. We benefit from the single market and do not want to stand in the way of the Eurozone resolving its difficulties. But we will not let the integration of the Eurozone jeopardise the integrity of the single market or in any way disadvantage the United Kingdom. And that is one of the important objectives we seek in our renegotiation with the European Union. And that is exactly the point that the Chancellor of the Exchequer was making in his Mansion House speech. So both my right honourable friends are right to raise the importance of this point, and it's a point that we fully recognise.
Just to clarify to the Minister, the 5 Presidents' press release and work programme, which is going to produce a white paper, is about taking over the European Union budget and using that for transfers throughout the Eurozone. And that is something that clearly Britain doesn't want to be part of. So I'm asking the Minister about the budget, not about single market regulations.
Well, I think the point applies across the piece. The position that we hold is that because of where we are in the Eurozone and because certain eventualities that my right honourable friend, to be fair to him, predicted many years ago have come to pass, The current situation of the Eurozone may well need substantial reform so that those members of a single currency are able to coordinate fiscal policy to a greater extent with greater fiscal transfers and so on. Now, that raises issues for the members of the Eurozone that don't apply to other members of the European Union who have access to the single market but would not wish to partake in any such arrangement. And we would need to ensure that if that is the direction that that the Eurozone goes in, the position of the Euro-outs is protected. That does mean, and that's why I mentioned the single market. The single market is an important part of that, to ensure that access to the single market remains in place for all 28 member states, but that our position is protected, and that's the point I wish to make. And I fully understand that the point that my right honourable friend is making on this point. Now, if I may, Mr. Williams, I should touch on Amendment 4 very briefly, which is the final amendment that has been proposed in order that the conditions set out in new clauses 1, 2 and 3 are consistent with the terms of commencement in the bill. Given that I've explained to the House why we will not be supporting new clauses 1, 2 and 3, we therefore reject the new clauses as proposed. Now, there's also just one other point I would like to make while I have the opportunity, which was just to identify, I'm afraid, an error in the explanatory notes, which was a typographical error, which is that on paragraph 6 of the explanatory notes which accompany this bill, line 2 refers to a VAT-based rate of call of 15% for Germany, the Netherlands and Sweden. This should have read a 0.15% figure, and I'd just like to draw the House's attention to that point in case that was going to cause consternation amongst honourable and right honourable members. In conclusion, in terms of the new clauses and the amendment before us, let me assure the honourable member that having made important progress in 2013, this government is focused on ensuring maximum restraint, budgetary control, value for money and transparency when it comes to EU spending. In that respect, I welcome the spirit of these amendments, but requiring the government to request of the Commission or the Council of Ministers that they review these issues adds, I believe, little to the real work that has been done and continues to be done to improve the working of the EU budget. That work began with the Prime Minister's historic deal, which cut the budget in real terms and protected the current system of financing, which we should not forget is what this bill is actually about. That work continues through the Budget 4 results, through the government's continued engagement on the annual budget and the discharge on the discharge of the budget, and that work will continue during the mid-term review of the MFF. With those few brief introductory remarks out the way, I urge the honourable member for Worsley to withdraw these amendments and for honourable members to support the clauses set out in the bill.
Keeley.
Thank you, Mr Williams. Could I just point out before we go any further that my constituency is now called Worsley and Eccles South. The people of Eccles would be very upset if we left them out of the equation, and quite rightly. Eccles is a very important town in my constituency. So I rise to speak to the new clauses tabled in my name and those of my honourable friends. There is a slight complexity in that the bill is simple as drafted, but in such a way that it is complex to amend. So Amendment 1 is a technical paving amendment which can bring in the new clauses, and so it will be Amendment 1 that we will want to push to the vote if necessary. The bill relates to agreement of the own resources decision to be incorporated into UK law based on the agreement reached at the February 2013 European Council, which the Minister has covered at very great length over the last hour and 20 or so minutes. Now, decisions on UK contributions reaching €14 billion, I feel, Mr Williams, are brought into sharper focus in a week when government ministers are discussing cuts to tax credits for the low paid and have not been prepared to rule out cuts to financial supports for disabled people. This is a serious and austere financial context we find ourselves in. So I'm going to say, in what I'm going to say today, that we must ensure that we look at every aspect of value for money, budgetary control and reform of priorities within the EU budget. Now, when we debated the multi-annual financial framework in this House in October 2012, the government's motion talked about agreeing that we must see significant improvements in the financial management of EU resources by the Commission and by Member States, and significant improvements in the value of money for spend. And I think in the last debate there were very many examples, and I'm going to refer to some of them, which show that we are not there yet. I'm sure that the Minister would agree we are not there yet. And what we're simply trying to do with the new clauses is try to find ways in which we can enhance value for money, assessments, budgetary control and reform of priorities, which is very important, I think, to many of the members here and throughout the House. The amendments to this bill, tabled in my name and those of my friends, will assist greatly in ensuring that reports are made to this House on value for money and budgetary control and on budget priorities and waste and efficiency within the EU budget. There have been examples given in this debate, even so far, by interventions that members have made, which really give an understanding, as we explored in the second reading debate, how much there are concerns about this out in the country. And of course, these concerns can only increase. Yes, please.
Maybe let me know which of her friends are so supportive of her. There appears to be a somewhat dearth of support.
Well, I rise to assure my honourable friend that I'm supporting her very strongly today.
I think you'll see when we come to the vote that we do have support. Our third amendment would also improve accountability and transparency by inviting EU budget representatives to appear before the European scrutiny committees in this House and the other place each year before EU budgets are negotiated. And I appreciate the points made by the honourable member opposite that, of course, there should be no interference with the work of European scrutiny committees in this House. But really, altogether, what we've tried to do in these new clauses is try to send the strongest statement that we can send, the strongest support, if you like, for all of those in this House who want to see these important aspects of value for money and budgetary control. Yes, indeed, yeah.
I'm sure she would appreciate that the European Scrutiny Committee functions by virtue of the standing orders of this House of Commons. And if, indeed, for example, quite apart from the merits of this particular proposal, there were to be a stream of requirements imposed by Parliament on the manner in which the European Scrutiny Committee were to conduct its business, which is an all-party committee and has many members of their own sign on it, then it would make the life of the European Scrutiny Committee pretty intolerable and actually would probably undermine its purpose.
I very much take that point on board. I very much do. New Clause 1 requests a review by the European Commission of the basis for appropriations for the EU budget and a study of whether alternative arrangements might offer improved value and enhanced budgetary control. Now, in our debate on the second reading of the bill, I highlighted a concern between the growing gap between the ceiling on spending commitments and the ceiling on payments. That gap, as agreed in the settlement of February 2013, is between €960 billion on commitments and €908 billion on payments. And that gap, as I pointed out in the earlier debate, has crept up from an average of 2.6% to the current 5.4%. And it's projected to rise to 5.7% in the period 2014 to 2020. I want to seriously question whether that gap is manageable. The Commission describes the system like this. Commitments are tomorrow's payments and payments are yesterday's commitments. Commitments are planned future payments, whereas payments are legal obligations from the past. If every year the increase in commitments is much higher than that in payments, you end up promising many partners to pay their future bills, but you find yourself unable to pay those bills when they arrive years later. This is what has been happening over the last years, as many commitments were made years ago for projects that are being completed now. Now, this, I want to say to the Minister, is a key issue with the drive to smaller EU budgets. Yet, as the Commission says, many bills related to projects remain unpaid and have to be rolled over to the following year. This leaves no choice to the Commission but to call for increases in payments. I give way.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way. I entirely agree with her about the need to get better value for money in a smaller budget and to bring the commitments down. Does she have some individual proposals on things that could be taken out of the EU budget which the government should argue for?
I think we could get to that if we had the information in the review that I'm calling for. But what I'm calling for first is an examination of this system, because this system, it seems to me, is like a recipe to drive up budgets rather than a way to control them. Commitments are being made at a level of up to €14 billion a year more than payments. We've had years when the commitments have been 14 billion more, and that means bills being rolled forward or staying unpaid, and that's not acceptable. That's not a sensible system. I think the Minister actually acknowledged that this is not a sensible system. If it's not a sensible system, it's one that we shouldn't be going along with.
Ways, you're making a fair point. It's been suggested that in real terms we should be paying 7% less into the European Union budget by 2020, I think. Given what she's just said, is it not likely that actually that won't turn out to be true and we will not be seeing a reduction of that kind?
Indeed, and that's a very real fear. If one just looks down the list of commitments compared to the payments made and sees the level of commitments that are still to roll forward, then it's a very frightening prospect. And so I go back to the point I've just made. This is a system designed to drive up budgets. Clearly what we saw in that difficult negotiation, and we of course support what has taken place, and the House voted for that back in 2012. But unless this system changes, we're going to be in a situation where commitments are being made in the period up to 2020 of €960 billion, and that's 52 billion more, and it's a serious matter. Clearly it's serious if the Commission is taking on projects and then not paying bills, but it's the upward pressure on the budget process that is the great concern. And in our last debate on this bill, honourable members from Corby, North East Somerset, Luton North and Daventry contributed to the debate. They referred to a range of concerns that their constituents had about EU finance, how the EU budget is spent, and the need for control of the budget. This is a point to which we'll keep returning. Also, in the debate of 15th of January 2008 on the committee stage of the European Communities Finance Bill, I've already mentioned this, the Financial Secretary and his shadow Treasury colleagues call for a report on all aspects of EU spending. So clearly, both in opposition and with the current opposition, there are concerns about this. So he and his colleagues called for that in 2008. I hope we still have time in the rest of this debate for him to repent his view that we don't need further reviews. There were, as I've mentioned, complications in the wording of the amendment in 2008, because the difficulty, I've read through that debate, that the honourable gentleman and his friends on the Shadow Treasury bench at that time ran into, was that it called for Treasury certification, that it considers the outcome of the review is satisfactory to the interests of the United Kingdom, and that seemed to be the sticking point. So we have avoided such complications in this bill by tabling simpler amendments which just ask for an analysis of the basis used for appropriations and a study of alternative arrangements. The Minister has said, in fact, that such a review is ongoing. Could he tell me at this point when that review will come forward? When will we see that in this House?
Well, in terms of the timing, I think that we're expecting that in 2016.
Could he clarify at which point in 2016? No, just sometime in 2016. Well, he can hear the comments that are being made from a sedentary position. Clearly, this is a crucial time we're working through in the run-up to the referendum. And this information, the budgetary information, is actually going to be crucial for people out there with all the decisions that have to be made. So we do, and we push forward in our amendments, we want to have these reviews and the reports because we want to send a message that this House is serious about scrutiny of the EU budget. At the end of our debate on the second reading of this bill, the Economic Secretary talked about the need for scrutiny on the payment gap. She told us that the European Commission has committed to publishing more frequently its analysis on payment forecasts. Now, I join the Honourable Lady in welcoming an enhanced level of information on the EU budget, but I believe there is still much more to do on that. So I do want to ask the Minister if he agrees now, having both of us spoken on this, that it's time the EU moved away from a system in which it can make commitments of billions of euros more than it can pay, creating pressure on Member States to ever-increasing budgets. New Clause 2 calls for a reform of the priorities within the EU budget and specifically requests a review by the Council of Ministers of budget priorities, waste and inefficiency within the EU budget. He has mentioned various reviews already taking place, but I don't think that he mentioned a review of priorities in the way that our New Clause 2 invites. In our debate on second reading, I raised the need for further reform to budget priorities, and on this side of the House, we believe that expenditure on growth and jobs should continue to be prioritised, and that would have to be by cutting back even further on agricultural spending. The Financial Secretary told us that overall spending on the Common Agricultural Policy will fall by 13% compared with the last financial period, and that spending on research and development will increase by 4%. Now, it is the case, Mr Williams, that as welcome as that fall in agricultural spending is, we believe that the level of spending is still too high compared to spending to support growth and jobs. And the Minister has responded to points made by his own side today, but I don't think he's really got to the nub of the point. I said in the second reading of this bill that agriculture only accounts for 1.6% of the European Union's total output. If this is the case, I think we're going to keep returning to this. Is it still appropriate that it accounts for 30 to 40% of the budget? So it has fallen. Yes, indeed.
Is she saying that, in the opinion of the Labour Party, agricultural support and spending is too low in Wales?
I'm not making that point in particular. What we're asking for in this clause, we're asking for a review of budget priorities, and we can see from our view the proportion, the percentage spent on competitiveness for jobs and growth is the most important. So I'm not making specific points about specific countries. I'm not making splits. I think there is, under the new method in terms of agricultural spending, of a great deal of flexibility for allocating the funding between countries. Yes, I will.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. She's making a very strong point about the CAP. And would it not be sensible, actually, if there were no CAP, we could still subsidise sections of our own agriculture according to what we think is right, rather than what the European Union thinks is right?
Indeed, we could. Let me go on and just make a few more points about the proportion which is allocated to that very important priority of competitiveness for jobs and growth. In 2014, only around 15 billion euros will be spent by the EU on that budget priority, compared to over 41 billion for market-related spending and direct payments for agriculture. We'll keep coming back to this, but there's no sense in a system which takes that vital priority, vital for every part of the EU, of competitiveness for jobs and growth, and spends so little of it. And out of the 6.3 billion euros of European Union funding allocated to the UK in 2013, only 23% of this was spent on jobs and growth, compared to 63% of spending on agriculture. So it's the balance that we're calling into account. So, as my honourable friend for Luton North, he's just intervened again, said in the second reading debate, although the proportion of the budget for agriculture has been falling, in money terms over the last 8 years, there has been a fairly significant increase. I don't think we'll get away, Mr Williams, from the point that as long as this balance seems wrong to people, as long as it seems wrong in terms of the country, I think it would be very hard for many of us to explain on the doorstep why we were only spending 23% of European Union funding in the UK on jobs and growth, but 63% on agriculture. Some honourable members might find that easier in their constituencies than others, but that's a difficult argument. Yes, I will.
I'm very grateful to the Honourable Lady for giving way, and I'm very sympathetic to what she's saying. My one concern would be that if there are reforms, they don't disadvantage some farmers in North East Somerset and other rural constituencies to favour spending on the continent, and that reform is quite right, but it needs to be fair to the United Kingdom's farmers.
Well, I think the more that we have reviews done of these priorities and the more that we have a developed understanding of where the money is going, and earlier one of the honourable members on his side called for these matters to be discussed in language that his constituents can understand. And I think there are not. I mean, having ploughed the way through very many debates and very many documents for this bill today, then I have to say I don't think those matters are understood, but the honourable gentleman is quite right. In terms of this debate on this bill, the Economic Secretary said that she accepted that expenditure on the Common Agricultural Policy is still too high, both in absolute terms as a proportion of the overall budget. If that's what the Treasury team currently feel, that it's still too high, both in absolute terms as a proportion of the overall budget, then what are we doing to understand that better? What are we doing to review it? What are we doing to change it? Because it's my assertion today that previous reviews have not led to the level of reform we want to achieve. That's why we have tabled new Clause 2, to keep focus on this vital issue. At a time when most member states are having to make very difficult decisions, and clearly we're in that situation ourselves about their own budgets and spending, the European Union must make sure that expenditure is efficient and focused on addressing the major concerns that member states faced. And as my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham East, said in the debate of 31st October 2012, the next 7 years of the EU budget should prioritise jobs, growth, infrastructure and practical programmes that rejuvenate fragile economies. And as I mentioned in the second reading debate, this is much needed when we still have 735,000 16 to 24-year-olds in the UK who are looking for work. That should be our focus, those young people. So we need a better balance of funding, and we need the European Union to provide a better framework and strategy to achieve growth and jobs. Looking further at the detail of this, on the spending commitment to the EU's smart and inclusive growth priority, only a quarter of that is spent on competitiveness for jobs and growth, and 3/4 on the European Union's cohesion policies, including structural funds. Now, I don't know if it's appropriate to open up, it probably isn't for this debate, Mr Williams, further debate about the use of structural funds. This is very often discussed when we are discussing EU finance. But my honourable friend, the member for Nottingham East, said in the debate of 31st October 2012, savings can be made on aspects of EU structural funds that are too often committed in a haphazard manner and depend on outdated commitments rather than future priorities. Unless structural funds contribute to positive economic development, they cannot be justified. So we say strongly on this side of the House that the proportion of the EU's smart and inclusive growth expenditure that is going towards securing competitiveness for jobs and growth is just too small. This important area of spending accounts, as I've said, for around a quarter of the EU budget in 2014, but that only rises to 27% across the whole 6-year period. Yes, indeed.
Does she appreciate that much of what she says in terms of generalities is understandable, and it is reflected very much in European Commission documents, which I've been looking at for the last 30 years, one way or another, on the European Scrutiny Committee, but that the inherent problem is the fact that every time there is a need for arguing for jobs and growth, the answer from the European Commission is to give more subsidies, more bailouts, and more cohesion and structural funds, when actually what is needed is deregulation and to provide people with a means of being able to increase productivity, jobs, and to deal with the youth unemployment.
Well, I hesitate to say that I think we agree on this point, but I think we do. All right, then, enthusiastically we agree on this point. It is very clear indeed that we, particularly with young people, with youth unemployment, that we have a serious problem. We have a serious problem. It's a problem all across the EU. We must spend more on that, and we must find a way of doing that. And the Minister spoke at very great length in opening this debate today, but he really didn't tell us at any point the difference there would be from a review that was ongoing in the EU, from existing commitments that were made. We really want to send out a very strong message. This is our last chance for a considerable period of time, once this bill is agreed, to actually make these points, to make this very strong position to the EU, and we believe that we should do so. Yes, indeed.
Thank the Honourable Lady for giving way. One of the issues that concerns me in the area that I represent in Strangford is the fishing industry, and the review of the common fisheries policy is one thing that's going to happen. But one thing that would come off the back of that would be encourage our young people to get jobs in the boats, because up until now they haven't been. And what we need is a better policy, a better common fisheries policy, but also encouragement and incentives for our young people to take the jobs in the local fishing boats and thereby create employment and prosperity for them as well. Does anybody agree with that?
Well, indeed. I mean, we focus a great deal on agriculture spending and the common agricultural policy, but I don't think any of us would really say that there'd been a fair deal for people in the fishing industry. Fisheries policy, you know, in many places has been a disaster and has actually caused great issues to our fishing industry. And it's a shame and a pity if young people cannot go and believe that they can have a career in fisheries, and I think that genuinely is the case. Yes.
Given that many people representing fishing constituencies would agree with her in making that point, does she not find it passing strange that in all of the possible treaty amendments that have been listed as possibilities of the Prime Minister's soon-to-be-discovered renegotiation stance, not once, I think, from the government front bench have I heard that a treaty renegotiation on the common fisheries policy is any part of the Conservative Party's priorities?
Yeah.
Well, that is strange, but I can't answer for the Minister opposite. I think he might want to comment for himself at now or some point later. He may want to do that. Jobs and growth I have really emphasised, but this priority, this EU budget priority, includes policies and programmes to promote vital areas of research and innovation as well, infrastructure, education, training and enterprise development. And I want to just touch on the fact that my honourable friend, the member for Sheffield Central, has been a staunch advocate of the importance of EU funding for research and development in the UK. In the debate on the 31st of October, 2012, he said, "The more the EU invests in research and innovation, the more the UK benefits, because the quality, breadth and depth of UK research puts us in a position whereby we gain disproportionately from European research programmes." So it's absolutely self-evident that there should be more of a priority on competitiveness for jobs and growth, but also that we would benefit more if priorities were switched so that we did better in terms of funding for research and innovation. So, serious consideration and reform of the European Union spending priorities are needed if we are to use the EU budget, as we believe we should do on this side, as a mechanism to promote future jobs and growth in the UK and other member states. We can only get this change of spending priorities if we keep a focus on the balance between competing priorities and continue to drive down wasteful and inefficient spending. Now, much was said, and the Minister, I'm sure, recalls it in the second reading debate, about what honourable members consider to be wasteful and inefficient spending. It might be that some members cover that again, but we've already talked about staffing costs here today, administration costs, and I think it was raised the cost of the move between Brussels and Strasbourg. Those tend to come up. But there are other items of waste and inefficiency in spending that we drew to the Minister's attention. Finally, we come to new clause 3, which we've already discussed to a certain extent, so I don't need to keep on emphasising. But we did, in moving new clause 3, not in any way want to disturb the balance between the government and scrutiny committees, European scrutiny committees, and I hope the honourable members will accept that. But we have had in future debates, I refer back to them, a number of points on why we need that relentless scrutiny. My honourable friend, the member for Nottingham East, said in the debate on the multi-annual financial framework in 2012, we need a relentless focus on the justification behind detailed expenditure. And the Financial Secretary himself said in the second reading debate, many in Europe agree with us that the EU is too uncompetitive, too democratically unaccountable and too inflexible to the concerns of citizens and its member states. That's a very poor situation that we find ourselves in. Yes, I can.
The Honourable Lady referred to the need for relentless scrutiny. I have a sort of thought in my mind that maybe some people think the European Scrutiny Committee, at least over the last 5 years, has indeed been relentless in its scrutiny, and that goes for all members of the committee, where we've had a number of unanimous reports. Is she effectively, if I may ask her, prepared to withdraw that amendment because of the problem I gave about the constant stream of legislative requirements that might interfere with our status as a European committee?
Well, indeed, we could do that. I think we could. I think we would want to push. We would definitely want to push the other new clauses, but I did not. There was no intention, either in my putting that forward or my honourable friends putting that forward, want in any way to upset that balance. But I do think it's important that today. I mean, it's been suggested that these matters could be solved by some kind of undertaking by the minister on the matters that we've raised in our new clauses. We don't reserve a position where we want to send out the strongest message possible from this House that we are serious about scrutiny. The European Scrutiny Committee is, of course, relentless in its focus on the matters that I've talked about. I think the difficulty is the rest of the House now has to be that relentless, and doubtless we will have very many more reports and reviews. I do want to say that, to hark back to the debate, the minister, when he was a shadow minister, was part of a team that put forward that amendment which I mentioned earlier to get a report. Now, the report was not agreed. The amendment to get the report was not agreed in this House, but the Commission review went ahead anyway. And I think it's interesting to look at the results of that report as were published in 2010. Its main finding, and it's not a very substantial finding, was that the current rules for the EU budget make it slow to react to unforeseen events, while too many complexities hinder its efficiency and transparency. This is a week of tumultuous events, Mr Williams, for the European Union. It's clear to all that the situation we find ourselves in with the EU budget and its complexity, its slowness to react, the difficulty in balancing priorities, the fact that it doesn't represent the priorities that we think are important, I think it's broad agreement very often in debates in this House, and I'm sure it will be today, that it's past time that that has changed. Our remaining amendments will assist in ensuring that reports are made to this House on value for money and budgetary control, and importantly on budget priorities and waste and efficiency, and I commend them to the House.
Sir William Cash.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr Howell. I've said much of what I need to say already on this question of New Clause 3, which was my main concern today and why I came to the House to make a few points. Basically, it's just that New Clause 3 is inappropriate. The European Scrutiny Committee does its job, as the Shadow Minister has just indicated, relentlessly. And the fact is that there is no need for it. We can invite officials if we wish to do so. We do on occasions, but we are scrutinising the budget perpetually, recommending the matters for the floor of the House. And I think that the idea of imposing on the European Scrutiny Committee legislative functions, which would be monitored by other government departments, could cause an enormous amount of difficulty in interfering with the standing orders functions of the European Scrutiny Committee, which has to form a judgment under its standing orders about what is of political and legal importance. I would say, however, that with regard to the European Commission budget representatives, we can invite European Commission representatives to see us, and indeed we can also recommend that the Treasury Select Committee, for example, may wish to do so. So we've got various means already at our disposal, and I think it would really not be necessary for me to make any further points that I haven't already made in interventions. So I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady for withdrawing that amendment, just simply for the record, so that nobody else in the future may be tempted to impose on any select committee legislative requirements which might in one way or another interfere with their discretionary judgments under their standing orders. Yes.
Keeley.
We'll just accept the assurance I want to make him that we had no intention of doing that, but I hope he agrees that it's important that we send out the strongest message possible that this House is actually focusing relentlessly throughout the House, and that the Scrutiny Committee will carry on doing that excellent work that it has been doing.
I hope she won't mind my mentioning the fact that she is standing in glorious, isolated position on the front bench with nobody other than my honourable friend, the member for Luton, who is not known to be enthusiastic about all matters European. So I would say that maybe the relentless scrutiny which she's referring to might be improved by having a few more of her own members there to support her.
Mr Williams, it's a great pleasure to follow what must be the briefest speech I can ever remember from the right honourable gentleman on this subject, the member for Stone. Although it is wonderful to see him back standing in his place today. Can I turn to the question of EU finance on agriculture in particular? Now, I know that agriculture is not a subject that much concerns the Conservative Party these days. The Tory Party are much more likely to be concerned with asset stripping rather than agricultural production, and much more concerned with financial derivatives in agricultural crops these days. That's what gets the pulse of the Conservative Party moving. But I was concerned that when the Honourable Lady from Worsley and Eccles said that she thought that far too much of the European Union budget was consumed by the Common Agricultural Policy, there wasn't the very simple point made from the government benches. The fundamental reason for that is that the Common Agricultural Policy is one of the few policies which is totally under the competence, or effectively financially under the competence of the European Union. If, for example, the European Union had the competence over health, for example, and I doubt if there's much support from me or anyone else in this House for that to happen, but if it had happened, then the agricultural budget of the European Union would totally be dwarfed by what was being spent on health by the European Union. The dominance of the agricultural budget is a factor of it being one of the relatively few common policies of the European Union. Now, of course, it is possible to argue that there shouldn't be direct farm payments. Indeed, that was the argument that the Right Honourable Member for North Shropshire took into the CAP negotiations. He started from the position that the UK Government, without much opposition from the members from rural constituencies and the Conservative interest, he took the position that there shouldn't be direct farm payments, and found himself in a minority of one in the negotiations. It wasn't a position that was supported by any other member state of the European Union. So, and therefore it's been decided that we are continuing with farm payments. And therefore, if we have a common agricultural policy, and it is very much a substantial part of the European Union budget, then it's reasonably important to ensure that our share, and the share of component nations in these islands, of that agricultural budget is fair, is competitive, because that agricultural production has to compete in that common market with other countries across the European Union. And this is the point I want to turn to, and to question the Minister on what he really thinks that the share allocated to UK agriculture, and to the agriculture of Scotland in particular, can be counted as a considerable achievement, as he claimed in his opening remarks. Can we just remind ourselves of some of the facts? And we look at Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Under Pillar 1 of the CAP budget, it was agreed that the lowest that any member state should receive in terms of support was €196 per hectare. That is the minimum. It was agreed as part of the negotiations that each country in the original 15 would work to that minimum. Scotland receives substantially less than that, just over half of that payment per hectare. That's going to cost Scottish agriculture about £1 billion in the period to 2019. In terms of... yeah, sure.
I'm grateful to him for giving way. He mentioned during the Minister's speech from a sedentary position that was because of Scottish farms are the biggest farms in the UK. It would be really helpful if he could give a little bit more flavour to the size of Scottish farms compared with English, Welsh and Irish farms, and how those numbers break down.
Very point, because I was inspired by the Minister's reply to my intervention to go off to the library to actually ascertain some figures, and I'm going to be coming to that point just in a few seconds. But before I come to that point, let me move on to Pillar 2, the second aspect, major aspect of agricultural support. I've been doing some comparisons of what if had happened during negotiations that Scotland had achieved from Pillar 2 of agricultural support, if Scotland had achieved the same amount as the Republic of Ireland, which in many ways is a very comparable country in terms of land area and in terms of agriculture as a share of the overall economy now. And the answer is that Ireland has achieved a position of 4 times the size of Scotland's budget under Pillar 2, £2.19 billion, compared to £478 million in the years to 2019. So what I want to put to the Minister is this, that given we are in a situation where it's been decided that common agricultural policy continues, that farm payments continue to be made, then how is it going to be possible for Scottish agriculture to effectively compete when it gets such a dramatically lower share than the minimum allocated to any other EU country? And in terms of Pillar 2, far from getting an excellent deal in Pillar 2 to compensate for the poor deal in Pillar 1, it gets a miserable share in comparison to comparable countries. Now, this brings me on exactly to the point that the honourable gentleman just intervened in. The Minister said in comparison, well, that doesn't really matter. Despite the fact, of course, that these are agreements per country, per hectare per country, to govern the size of the overall budget, I would say that's exactly what matters. Because, as the Minister pointed out, if you look at share per farm or per estate, then there's a different figure, a different comparison, because we have some very large farms and some very, very large estates in Scotland. Indeed, we come to a position, and this is the point I was checking in the library, that there are 500 companies or individuals own half of the country. That is how imbalanced the situation is in terms of the concentration of ownership in Scottish agriculture and indeed in Scottish land. And of course it is the feature that if you're receiving a lower payment per hectare, then that does tend to favour and to mitigate for the concentration even further of land ownership. Now, I'm delighted to tell the Minister, because I had to take his reply to me, I took as a coded call for a fairer distribution of land ownership in Scotland, as he alighted on a very significant point. And that inspired me to have a look at an article in the Spectator magazine from last month entitled "David Cameron's Father-in-Law Offers to Adopt a Rob Roy-style Scottish Accent to Stop a Mugabe-style Land Grab by the SNP." And sure enough, Viscount Astor, writing in the Spectator magazine only last month, presumably to get to that wide audience that the Conservative Party were after in terms of this European debate, was extremely suspicious of the SNP Scottish Government's proposals on land reform, which are being enunciated in the Scottish Parliament this very day. Well, I am delighted to reassure the Minister first that there is no Mugabe-style land grab intended, just to look for a fairer distribution of agriculture so that family farms and communities across Scotland get a more equitable distribution of the land holdings. But of course it will also help to answer his point of why it cannot be seriously argued that looking at payments per individual farm or estate, whether they own 200 or 300 acres, or in the case of Viscount Astor 20,000 acres, that cannot be given as a serious argument against an imbalance of agricultural support. And what has added substantial insult to injury in these matters is when the European Union, after representations from the Scottish Government and others, tried in a minimalist fashion to address these imbalances which had occurred out of the total incompetence of the UK Government's negotiations and their stance on the CAP, and decided to allocate €220 million as convergence money to take account of the fact there was such an imbalance in support per hectare in the United Kingdom and in Scotland in particular compared to the rest of Europe. All of that £220 million is to be distributed geographically across the UK instead of accepting that we're getting the convergence money because of the dramatic imbalance in the huge land holdings in Scotland and the very, very low payments per hectare. Now, I've heard that described in NFU meetings in Scotland as akin to embezzlement by the United Kingdom government. That's how it's regarded. And I hope the Minister, in summing up, will try to address that point and revisit the issue, at least of the convergence money, if not revisiting the issue which should be revisited, and that is to say, to get a fairer distribution of agricultural support, because if an industry is in a competitive position in a common market with other industries, then it has to have a fair distribution of support in order to compete effectively. Sure.
I've been listening with some interest to the points he's been making around funding and funding into Scotland. How does he believe this support would be getting on without the benefit of the UK's rebate?
Is that a serious point?
Well, can I just point out that one of the reasons why we do so incredibly badly, as far as many European programmes and funding is concerned, is that the Treasury interest, when looking at additionality, as they call it, is always to minimise EU expenditure. And while, of course, it's perfectly acceptable for the government to defend the rebate, it's less acceptable to look at every European programme and try to minimise expenditure on it, because in doing so, then we lose some of the opportunities that the Honourable Lady from Worsley and Eccles was talking about in terms of distribution of our programme. If the Treasury looks at every European programme and says, how do we minimise spending, then what follows and what is a natural consequence is that our share of that spending is also diminished. And in the case of the Common Agricultural Policy, I think it's possible to take a direct connection between the negotiating stance of the Right Honourable Member for North Shropshire, who was trying to abolish farm payments altogether, and ending up with such a miserable, unfair, inequitable distribution of the support, which has been the end result of the CAP negotiations. And finally, I want to make this point. The Minister, and I'm not sure if it was a dead bat or a glorious drive through covers or maybe caught its slips, I'm not quite certain, but the Minister rather evaded the direct question of what is the Prime Minister's negotiating stance as far as the budget is concerned. The Minister said, after being passed a note, that the Prime Minister's stance was to cut the whole budget and to protect the UK rebate. Can I point out that has been the government's stance and policy since it took office in 2010. That is not a negotiating stance for these renegotiations. What the Minister is being asked, and we really would like an answer, is has the Prime Minister a specific target in mind as far as the renegotiations are concerned for changes in the EU budget or the UK contribution to it? And if he has, then what is it? And failure to answer that question throughout the debate just lends to the no doubt unworthy but considerable suspicion which is shared across this chamber, is that the Prime Minister is adopting this nebulous approach to what his negotiating aims are, so that whatever he comes back with can be announced as a fundamental achievement. I don't think that is going to stand scrutiny on this committee, but even more important is a particularly poor campaigning argument to take in favour of the European cause. So I hope that the Minister, the last man in, rises to the occasion, and when he sums up at that dispatch box, confirms that he is in favour of more equitable distribution of land ownership in Scotland, and also gives us an insight in this House into the Prime Minister's true negotiating hand in the negotiations and arguments and discussions to come in the European Union.
Rees-Mogg.
Thank you. I just want to follow on from the Right Honourable Gentleman, the Member for Gordon, because I think his speech is tremendously important and does get to the heart of one of the issues we have on the Common Agricultural Policy. Though not surprisingly, I look at a different way from the question of socialism and land holdings, which I think is what the SNP is going for. The issue is, and this has been discussed at European scrutiny committees, is that our farmers have, over the years, become increasingly efficient and large, that there has been a good deal of consolidation, and this applies very much in my own constituency amongst dairy farmers, that the number of dairy farms has reduced significantly, and they are bigger farms proportionately. But European subsidies tend to go to smaller farms disproportionately, and therefore we find that British farmers are disadvantaged. And where I'm in entire agreement with the Right Honourable Gentleman, the member for Gordon, is when he says that if you have a system of farming subsidies and you have a competitive framework that means that people are getting handouts from the European Union, if British farmers in the United Kingdom, do not get the equivalent subsidies from farmers on the continent, they are disadvantaged because their cost base is automatically higher and their profitability is reduced. And that therefore, when we are arguing for careful consideration, overview, oversight of expenditure in the European Union and indeed reductions in the common agricultural policy, we have to ensure that the cuts are made in a way that is fair to the UK farmer, even if our end objective is the entire elimination of agricultural subsidies. It must be done in a way. Of course, I agree with the Honourable Gentleman.
Very gracious, thank you for giving way. In Northern Ireland, the farms, as the Honourable Gentleman I'm sure is very aware of, are smaller farms. But they're greater today than what they were, say, 20 years ago, but they're still not big in comparison to the UK mainland. Does he feel, as I feel, that the farms in Northern Ireland and the constituency that I represent in Strangford in particular, there needs to be consideration for those farms in relation to what the Honourable Member is saying, because he seems to be referring to those farms that are very large. Farms of an average of 150 acres is what we would have in Northern Ireland.
I'm very sympathetic to farmers, and I ought to declare an interest, as I do have little land in Somerset, though sadly not a great deal, and I don't farm directly. And if I did, I would certainly count as a very, very small farmer. But what I would say to that is that European subsidies have, in the past, taken a slice from the biggest receivers of subsidies, and therefore the farms that have been the most consolidated and the most efficient lose subsidies at a faster rate than other farms. So I think that protection is already in place. I give way to the Right Honourable Gentleman.
Which is why the protection built into the agricultural settlement of €196 per hectare is so important, and why it's so disadvantageous to be almost half of that in the case of Scotland. That's why the minimum per hectare is so important.
Well, being more traditional, I would prefer a minimum per acre, but otherwise I am broadly in agreement with the Right Honourable Gentleman. I do agree that it is not right to look at it purely in terms of the landowner, because then you discourage consolidation. And as Conservatives, we are in favour of efficiency within all industries, but the subsidy system across Europe not only disadvantages our farmers, but also discourages consolidation and efficiency, and that cannot be the right way to approach it.
Is the Honourable Gentleman telling us that consolidation and enlargement always equals efficiency? Does he not recognise that, especially in agriculture, there are significant community and social benefits to having small family-owned farms that are still allowed to continue in existence?
There are great advantages to small family-owned farms, but actually we need an efficient agricultural system that provides the food and produce that the country needs. I don't think one should be unduly sentimental for agriculture against other industries. So tempted though I am, as a lover of the countryside and of our rural traditions, to fall in line with the Honourable Gentleman for Glenrothes, I'm so sorry. Glenrothes is in Central Fife, isn't it? It was Central Fife when I stood there, and is now Glenrothes, unsuccessfully, just for the record. So although I'm sympathetic to his point, actually I think it is important to have efficient agriculture first. When you're spending other hard-pressed taxpayers' money, it oughtn't to be entirely about sentimentality.
Kelvin Hopkins.
Thank you, Mr. Williams. Well, it's a great pleasure to follow the Honourable Member for North East Somerset. And before I go into the main part of my speech, I would like to just comment on what he's just said, because some 34 years ago, my then 11-year-old son, they had a discussion at his primary school about what was then called the Common Market. And he was asked about the Common Agricultural Policy, and he knew a lot about it because he listened to me at home. And his teacher said, well, what is the CAP? And he said, it's this Common Agricultural Policy. What is that about then? Daniel, his name is. And he said, well, it's a way of subsidising inefficient small farms. And 34 years on, the Honourable Member of North East Somerset raised exactly the same point. And I think so. Some things don't change very much, but I think my son is the same age as the Honourable Member. But it's a great pleasure to follow also my honourable friend on the front bench and agree with her in supporting her new clauses and her amendment. And I'm very pleased that she's acceded to the point made by the Right Honourable Member for Stone, the chair of the European Scrutiny Committee, of which I'm also a member. A very sensible point been made and accepted. But the other two clauses, the other two new clauses, I would want to support, and I obviously support my honourable friend in the lobby later on. But I have spoken probably in European debates in this chamber, I would guess over 100 times in the last 18 years. I've said some of what I'm going to say today a number of times before, Mr. Williams, but then in politics, I think to make an effect, you have to sometimes repeat messages over and again, hoping that in time one's colleagues, particularly on the front bench, will listen and agree and take note and act accordingly. But the honourable member, Right Honourable Member for Stone, also made the point, which was I was much taken with, when he said that when he rebelled, he was trying to help his front bench, which is a splendid idea. Now, can I say that if ever I move to rebel in future, I shall put that point to my whip, who is sitting in the chamber now, that I'm really trying to help our front bench. So I hope she will accept it in that spirit. But the most interesting of those two new clauses, I think, is new clause 2, is about expenditures. I mean, I have said many times that I do believe that the CAP, Common Agricultural Policy, ought to be repatriated to member states, and for member states to decide what and how they subsidise their own agriculture, and for the structures of the CAP to be dismantled. We would certainly benefit financially from in more than one way. We would benefit because we wouldn't be paying in so much. We could subsidise it at exactly the same level and possibly in exactly the same way, but still be better off because we wouldn't be paying in to something where we are net losers. But beyond that, of course, the food prices. Food prices have over decades have been higher than they would otherwise be if we were not in the CAP and could buy food on world markets. Indeed, one of the markets we could buy would be within the European Union itself, because there are some low-cost food producers, particularly in Eastern Europe, from whom we might buy food. Some year or two back, with the chairman of the European Scrutiny Committee, we were in Lithuania, and I discovered, much to my surprise, that Lithuania used to be self-sufficient in food production. Now they are being paid not to grow food, and there are large swathes of land in Lithuania which are lying fallow. I think that is nonsense for a poorer country which was self-sufficient, now being paid not to grow food. If they were allowed to grow as much food as they like and we could buy it from them at relatively lower prices, I think that would be a very sensible arrangement. So as the CAP, I think, should be repatriated, the agriculture policy should be repatriated to member states to, I think, in the end, to everyone's advantage. Of course.
I don't think the Honourable Gentleman has ever been to Iceland or to Norway or to the Faroe Islands or places further north in Scotland. You will see a greater use of land than we see in the Highlands and Islands of Scotland because the agricultural support is so much better. But isn't there a danger of the repatriation to some countries that if you have what you would call the sort of Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-American model of economics, that they actually suck money out of the little that's there and it goes back into London and London doesn't put it around its own state? Whereas at least with Europe we've got some sort of guarantee that we're getting the money, even though the less favoured areas are least in what are the least favoured areas of land.
Well, the Honourable Minister makes a point, and he tempts me to talk at greater length about a broader, more socialist approach to running the world, which I would absolutely strongly agree with. But I think I would just start too many hairs running, and Mr. Williams would bring me to order very quickly, I think. But the CAP is I think, a nonsense and something that we ought to abolish and repatriate agricultural policy to member states. We can decide in our own country what parts of agriculture should be subsidised and to what extent they should be, and we could decide where and when we buy food. We might choose to subsidise to keep agriculture sustained in this country for strategic reasons, because I think in the Second World War we needed to produce food for ourselves, and all countries have to bear those sort of factors in mind when they're deciding what they produce as well. So we might do that. But then we come to the Common Fisheries Policy, and interestingly, Right Honourable Member for Gordon, he obviously doesn't like the Common Agricultural Policy very much, but he doesn't like the Common Fisheries Policy very much. I'm surprised that the SNP are actually in favour of the European Union at all.
The honourable member mistakes me. I think the Common Agricultural Policy is a failure of UK government negotiation, as I tried to explain. The Common Fisheries Policy is in much stronger ground, and I would support treaty amendment to change substantially, remove from central control the Common Fisheries Policy.
Well, we are in strong agreement on that point, and I've said many times in this chamber I think we ought to give notice of withdrawal from the Common Fisheries Policy if it's not abolished in total, so that countries could then could manage their own fisheries, our 200-mile limit or 50-50 limit, whatever, and that in that way fish stocks, I think, could be recovered because they'd be managed at national level, and we would license fishing boat from our own fishermen, but also if any other fishing boats came in from outside, they have to be licensed and managed properly.
Just to pursue the point that which is certainly within the competence of this financial bill, isn't it strange that the Common Fisheries Policy and a treaty amendment is never mentioned by the government as an objective? I mean, everything else gets mentioned as an objective in these negotiations, but the Common Fisheries Policy, to my knowledge at least, has never been identified by the Prime Minister as something he's even trying to get a change, far less a treaty amendment.
The honourable member makes a strong point, and indeed it's one of my red lines, and I shall be putting that case to the Prime Minister when I have an opportunity. And I have said it many times in this chamber before, of course. Yes.
Thank you, Honourable Member, for giving way. As I said earlier on, I represent the constituency of Strangford. Fishing industry in particular is very important to me. We have had a cod recovery programme in the Irish Sea for the last almost 10 to 12 years. We see greater numbers of cod in the Irish Sea than we ever seen in the last 10 years. The fish are bigger than ever were, but yet all Europe restricts our fishermen from being able to fish those cod. That's an example I see of where we need a new common fisheries policy that the local people can control and can have an input into.
Well, the honourable makes a point. Yeah.
Down that line of discussion.
I should move on to my other points, Mr. Williams, in a second. But can I just make this one point, if I may? That I agree with him. But if member states control their own fisheries water, they can stop irresponsible fishing and plundering of fish stocks by other nations who are not recording. But the honourable member there.
To the honourable gentleman for giving way. Going back to what he said a few moments ago about agriculture, is he aware that many farmers don't want to leave the European Union because they feel they'd be treated less generously if Britain came out of the Union? But is it not the case that if Britain did come out of the Union as a net contributor, we would actually have more money to spend on farming if we wished to do so?
Makes a very strong point, and indeed I've said that if we were outside, we would be better off in financial terms, but we could choose how we subsidise, what we subsidise, the extent to which we subsidise, what sort of farming we want to sustain. And I think it's made this point before that small hill farmers in Wales, part of our rural culture, ought to be preserved and not they may not be very efficient, but we would choose to subsidise those perhaps. But other forms of farming, we might choose to maintain subsidies at present levels or whatever. But we would make that choice democratically through our government and through this Parliament. So that, yes, of course.
Very good, Honourable Gentleman, for giving way before he moves on, indeed. And on the Common Fisheries Policy, I think the glib answer that was often given to me in this House in years past why we should maintain the CFP was fish didn't have passports. Of course, that neglects the reality that there are three types of stocks. There are migratory stocks, non-migratory stocks and straddling stocks. And when we look further to countries that do control their own fisheries, such as Iceland at the moment, Jon Sigurd Jonsson, the chief fishery scientist in Iceland, tells me that fishing has so improved in Iceland in many areas that trawlers are catching their cod stocks so much more quickly. The fishermen are actually getting frustrated at being so successful and doing their work in such little time. They want to go and catch more. But it's a sign of success where they have been in management of their own stocks over a number of decades.
And the honourable mentioned point, and he is well ahead of me in his expertise in this matter. But the basic point, we should control our own fish stocks and manage them properly. But I wanted to move on, Mr. Williams. I've got one or two other points I wish to make about expenditures within the EU budget. We've talked about, from time to time, the question of aid, international aid, is my view, and I think the view of probably differed, that we would spend aid, international aid, better than having that money spent through the European Union. We would target it better, we would manage it better, we would try to make sure that it was spent in a less corrupt way in certain countries. I think that countries would do better to manage their own aid donations abroad rather than having it dealt with through the European Union. But so we take away aid as another component of the EU budget. And then we come to structural funds. Well, again, I think member states, in particular our own country, is better able to judge what regional assistance we need to give within our country. We are better able to make that judgment. We could target it better rather than having these things decided by the European Union. Indeed, as part of regional policy, we might want to have state aids to assist the growth of manufacturing in some of the less successful regions in our country. And indeed, manufacturing is too small as a proportion of our economy. If we want to expand and improve our manufacturing sector to help investment, we might want to have state aids forbidden under the European Union arrangements. Of course.
Again, I'm very grateful for the Honourable Gentleman for giving way. Isn't the great danger there, though, that the High Priest of the austerity cult, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, would drive austerity further, and no, we wouldn't actually see that spending that we're seeing in areas of Wales and the Highlands and Islands of Scotland if he was in charge of that? We need actually to have that responsibility. From the position, the Honourable Member from Gordon says he'd keep it all for himself, he'd keep it all in London. Well, we need that. If that situation was to arrive, we need certainly devolution, full fiscal autonomy, or indeed independence, to make sure that we have areas of Scotland well protected.
Well, I thank the Honourable Member for intervening, but it's a count of despair to say that because we can't trust our own government, we've got to go to the European Union. I was on a march last Saturday, I have to say, Mr. Williams, through London, opposing austerity, and there were tens of thousands of people who felt strongly about it as well. And I do believe that even though we may have governments we don't like from time to time, we have the chance of pressurising them in the first short term, but in the longer term, getting rid of them and replacing them with more progressive governments. And that's what I do in politics, Mr. Williams, and I think we all do from every side. I want to see a government elected in this country, governing this country, not giving away our powers to be so that we're governed by a bureaucracy in Brussels or wherever. But these points about expenditure, I try to come back to those again. There's CAP, there's aid, there's structural funds, regional policy, and so on. Now, obviously, this would mean that some of the fiscal transfers that effectively take place between the richer and poorer countries in the European Union might not take place. So, if we want fiscal transfers, I would think that the way to do that would be to have us making substantial, significant contributions to a fund, which could then be allocated according to those to the governments of those countries which are less well off, if we choose to do so, so that Lithuania, Latvia, Poland, or wherever it is, could actually benefit from donations. But they would go to those governments, and those governments would decide how that money would be spent within their countries, not the European Union subsidising certain sectors in a way which may or may not be beneficial to that country. And I quote Lithuania and other countries, no doubt, where they are being paid not to grow agricultural products, not to grow their own food. I think that is nonsensical and something I would wish to see the end of. But if we want fiscal transfers, let's have fiscal transfers which are up front, where we contribute to a fund and poorer countries in the European Union or this new association of member states could draw on. And that would be, I think, a more sensible way forward. But of course, it would then loosen the bonds of the European Union very much. We wouldn't have decisions being made about all sorts of sectors in Brussels, within the Commission. They'd be made by democratic governments within the European Union. We'd have a looser association of states within Europe, which I would think be a much more sensible way of operating. So, in conclusion, Mr. Williams, I want to support what my honourable friend on the front bench has said, and to support her probing new clauses, and support her in her Amendment 1, which we hope we'll be voting on soon. Thank you.
Peter Grant.
Mr Williams, thank you. I apologise for not being able to say that in Welsh, despite your attempt at tuition last night, but I will keep practising. It struck me after the first two speakers that we'd spent an hour and 45 minutes discussing this bill, and the only point of contention appears to be, should the government write a letter, and if so, how many letters should they write? If we are serious about trying to sort out great European institutions that are inefficient and that have a lot of waste, I suspect that many of the audience of millions of watching live on television just now will ask us to hold up a mirror to our own faces, because it surely cannot be what this place was designed for. I found it quite interesting that although in theory the bill is about agreeing how the European Union gets its money in, a lot of the discussion has been about what happens to the money afterwards. And it seems to me that one of the big problems with the whole way the European Union manages or doesn't manage its finances is that it still has a complete divorce between decisions about how much money it needs and who's going to pay it, and decisions about how much money is going to be spent and how it's going to be spent. And until the European Union brings those two big decisions closer together, we're always likely to have anomalies where we talk all the time about what it costs, and maybe at some other point in the future we'll talk about what benefits we get or could hope to get from it. Now, I'm an accountant by profession, and if it is true that an accountant is somebody who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing, then the government benches today are full of accountants, because we've had a lot of questions about whose fault is it the costs have gone up and who gets the credit for the costs coming down. We haven't heard an awful lot about the benefits, and that is worrying if we're coming into a referendum that could see us torn out of the European Union, even if we vote to stay in. If all the talk is about what it costs and nobody is prepared to talk about the benefits, not just counting benefits to mean we get more money out than we put in, because it doesn't take a genius or even an accountant to work out that not everybody in the European Union can carry on taking out more than we put in. The benefits in trade, as a trading island state, surely there's a benefit to the removal of the trade barriers that I can remember as a wee boy, the trade wars, where the United Kingdom did something to upset the French. So the French discovered that British lamb was no longer fit for French consumers. And in retaliation, and completely by coincidence, the United Kingdom discovered that French apples maybe didn't quite come up to our standards. And so it went on. It was great for the lawyers. It was probably quite good for the politicians. It didn't actually help the producers of these foodstuffs, because they spent longer arguing about who is allowed to buy and sell what, and spent less time actually producing and making their businesses more efficient. We should never allow ourselves to forget that this year we mark 70 years since the United Kingdom or its predecessor states was at war with Germany. I don't think that condition has existed at any time before 1945. I've certainly been back through the books. I can't find a period of 75 years without a major war between the countries of Western Europe. Surely that has got to be something to be celebrated, and it's no coincidence that it started with the establishment of initially a common market, and with European nations looking for ways to settle the disputes without going to war. That to me has got to be a massive benefit of continued cooperation among European nations. And for the record, my position and the position of the Scottish National Party is that we want to be citizens of the European Union. We want to do it in such a way that we can have a state of cooperation with our European neighbours without losing the sovereign right of the people of Scotland. In fact, we want our cooperative relationship with our neighbours across the North Sea to be on exactly the same footing as the relationship we want to have with our neighbours across the Irish Sea and indeed across the River Tweed. There's been a lot of talk about the common fisheries policy and the common agricultural policy. And it should hardly be surprising that Scotland doesn't get a good deal out of the Common Agricultural Policy, because the longest-serving, most respected Agriculture Minister in the whole of Europe, possibly in the whole world, isn't allowed to take part in those discussions because he's not a minister of a member state. We are represented by somebody who's not even elected, has never faced the test of public accountability at the ballot box. We have an Agriculture Secretary who's quite possibly unique in the world, in that he holds the full confidence of his government and absolute trust of the farmers at the same time, and they don't let him in the door to be part of the discussions. It shouldn't be any surprise that the Common Fisheries Policy has never worked for Scotland when Luxembourg gets a vote on it and we don't. Luxembourg's population is the size of Edinburgh. I don't consider myself to be in a coastal constituency. My constituency has got a bigger coastline than Luxembourg. My constituency has got a coastline. Is it any surprise that so many of the major pillars of EU policy don't work in the area, in the communities where they have an effect, when so many of the decisions are taken by people who represent nations who don't have a fishing industry? They represent nations where agriculture is peripheral to the economy rather than being central to not only the economic but the social well-being of nations such as Scotland and indeed such as Northern Ireland and Wales. There was a question from the Conservative benches earlier on about the SNP's position in Europe. My view in Europe is I would love to see what kind of deal Scotland can get out of Europe when we have a voice in Europe. At the moment, every representation that we send to Europe has to go through the Westminster filter. And I don't blame the Westminster filter for changing it to act in the interests of the majority of the citizens of the United Kingdom. We're outnumbered by 10, 11, 12 to 1 in population terms. Therefore, the representations that the UK government makes to Europe are always going to be loaded towards what they see to be in the best interests of the people of the major nation state here.
He's making a very interesting point about the likely outcome of Scottish negotiations in Europe. But whatever they were, it's hardly likely that any Scottish negotiator in terms of agricultural support could have come back with less than the minimum awarded to every other European nation.
I don't know if that's a bid to be the first independent Scottish ambassador to the European Union, but I'll certainly, if I'm in a position to put anybody's name forward, I'll certainly bear in mind my right honourable friend from Gordon. But it does make a very valid point, and it relates to the point he's made repeatedly and still hasn't had answered about what is the Prime Minister's negotiating position going to be, what are the Prime Minister's negotiating priorities going to be. Because the fishing industry is not a massively important part of the economy of the United Kingdom. It is a massively important part of the economies of some of the nations that make up the United Kingdom. And as long as the negotiations are always carried out through the Westminster lens, and as long as it is seen as a major achievement, when all that we can come back with is not too many things have got worse. When we're talking about aspiration, I actually think aspiration means you want things to get better, not to think you've achieved a lot if you're able to come back from negotiations and haven't had to lose too much. So while we're looking at the way the European Union manages its finances, and I don't think they manage its finances very well at all. As I say, you don't need to be an accountant to work that out. Most companies wouldn't be allowed to continue if they went for 20 years without ever having their accounts audited. We do sometimes need to look at how we manage the part of it for which we're responsible. And it appeared to me that some of the discussions, I think particularly from the honourable member from the Labour Front bench speaking early on, a lot of the questions about scrutiny of the European budget and the performance and financial management of the European Union were pointing to weaknesses in the way that this House holds Europe to account to the extent that we have it within our powers here. It points to either to the lack of involvement of members in the European Union Scrutiny Committee, or maybe it's to the fact we haven't given that committee sufficient powers. A lot of the weaknesses in the way that European finances affect the responsibilities of this chamber, I think there are changes that can be made to the way that this House holds Europe to account that don't necessarily need to threaten to walk away from Europe altogether in order to have them delivered. A final point on the amendments, as I mentioned in the intervention earlier on, I can't see why that needs to be forced to a vote. I don't think there's any request in the amendment for anything that the government would be reluctant to do. I certainly would defer to the right honourable member who has now departed from Stone as to his expertise as to the procedures of the House and the position of the EU Scrutiny Committee. But for the rest, it's simply trying to give a statutory basis to asking the government to ask things of Europe on our behalf that no government in its right mind would be reluctant to do. How could any government not want to ask Europe to be more accountable? How could any government not want to ask Europe to think a wee bit more carefully about where its spending priorities are before it sets them? So I hope that we can see an outbreak of common sense on the government benches. I think it would strengthen the United Kingdom's position in whatever negotiations the Prime Minister is having if we can find a way for this bill to be approved unopposed. As I say, if it goes to a vote, I'm minded at the moment to go with the amendments. I think it would be sad if it was a matter of public record that this House divided on such an important matter on the crucial question of whether or not we wanted the Secretary of State to write a letter to Europe.
Good. Very good. Thank you, Mr. Williams. And we have had a wide-ranging debate over the last 2.5 hours. And actually, the substance before us, I think the honourable member for Glenrothes was not far off in terms of the disagreement is over whether there should be placed in statute a requirement to write a letter. I have to say I recognise the spirit of these amendments. I recognise the need for us to improve the value of expenditure within the European Union, to cut down on waste, to increase transparency. Those are points that we strongly support and indeed have advocated. I have to say that writing to the Commission to review these issues will not particularly achieve the objectives that we have heard set out. But the government has taken action and continues to take action to improve EU spending. That begins with the Prime Minister's historic deal cutting the budget in real terms, and that has forced the Commission to prioritise, and we very much welcome that. It has led to the Commission's Budget for Results initiative. The UK is playing an active role in this process, and we continue to push the Commission to bear down on waste in its responses to the EU budget discharge process. The government is contributing to the simplification proposals from the Commission, and the UK will continue to fight for restraint in the annual budget. These steps have led to concrete results. The Commission has become more transparent. The Commission has shifted more funding into pro-growth spending, and we certainly make no apologies for that, although there appears to be some resistance to it from some parts of the House. And the UK's contributions will be lower than the final year of the last year's MFF deal for every year in this 7-year deal period, a saving of almost £8 billion over the forecast period compared to 2013-14. Give way.
The Minister has resisted the amendments, and it sounds as if he is. Then I really would like to ask him if he can tell the House, is he happy with the balance of priorities in terms of the spending on competitiveness for jobs and growth, which was a key point that I spent a time talking about? Is he happy with that? Because he seems to be resisting any attempt to put forward a report that would make the point that would make it easier for this House to push for changes. Is he happy with the current balance?
Well, what we achieved in the 2013 negotiations was a shift towards a greater proportion of expenditure being on pro-growth measures like research and development, and away from other areas of expenditure which contribute less to growth, and that includes the common agricultural policy. Now, she says it's a small amount. It was nonetheless. Actually, it wasn't. It was a significant progress in terms of a reduction in the common agricultural policy, spending more on those areas that we want it to, where we think there can be greater added value. That is the right direction. I have to draw again the contrast with the surrender of £2 billion a year in terms of our rebate for common agricultural policy reform that we did not see, and that's I'm afraid, the record of the last Labour government with the 2005 deal. So I believe that we are moving in the right direction. Now, is she asking, would we like to go further? Yes, I very much support that view. I do think that we want to go further, and we do want to see a greater emphasis on expenditure that provides better value for money for the UK and the EU taxpayer. So that's very much what we want to do. I think what I would question is the idea that a letter, as she calls for, here is going to make any difference, particularly when we are seeing progress with the Commission's Budget for Results initiative. The working group will meet for the first time in July, and there'll be a major conference in September 2015. Of course, we want to continue this approach when it comes to the midterm review, which, as I referred to earlier, will occur in 2016. I'll give way again.
The Minister, because he was unable to give a date. Midterm reviews are one thing, but we're in a situation where we're moving towards a referendum. We all know that. This is the case that we're all going to have to build for our constituents, for the campaign out there, and we need this information sooner than that. The slow trundling on of the EU Commission is actually not going to suit our needs in this country, in this year and the next, for that information. And I would invite him perhaps to come to my constituency and try and explain that that's a really good deal, the split between competitiveness and growth, the amount that's spent on research and development, when we really should be pushing for that for our economy. We need to explain that, and we need that review to be done sooner. He can't even say when it is going to be done in 2016. It may be too late.
Well, the MFF will be in 2016, as I say. The reality is that trying to transfer expenditure in the way that we certainly want to do, from what she's saying she wants to do, although, as I say, it doesn't seem to have the support of all sides of all parts of the House, is a major task. We have made progress. And if she's saying that it's frustrating and she would like to go faster on that, I'm not disagreeing with her, but that is the way that I'm afraid that the European Union works. But we have clearly made progress, and I don't think it particularly does her cause any good to downplay the progress that we have made. I was going to turn directly to the issue of the Common Agricultural Policy, of which the Right Honourable Member for Gordon is such an enthusiast, subject to his complaint that he would like Scotland to have a greater share of the money that comes to the United Kingdom. What happened in terms of the renegotiation is that there was the fact that the UK's CAP receipts would fall over the next budgetary period in real terms. It was concluded that the fairest way of allocating this cut was through an equal proportionate reduction in both pillars across the United Kingdom, to have allocated more funding to Scotland or any other part of the United Kingdom would have meant deeper cuts across the rest of the United Kingdom. So that was the reason why the government took the steps that it did. I don't know if the honourable gentleman is wishing to intervene on that point.
That the Labour Party lost in terms of the budget rebate. Can he write to revisit the €220 million of convergence money, which instead of distributing by hectare, which is why we got it in the first place, the government has chosen not to do that? Does he realise how much bitterness that decision caused in the rural communities of Scotland, and no doubt contributed to the Conservative Party's worst election result in Scotland for a century last month?
Let me briefly make 2 points to him. There is no additional money for the United Kingdom. Over the next funding period, the UK's direct payments will fall by around €500 million compared to 2013. And the most appropriate way of allocating this cut, as I said earlier, is to share it equally between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And to have given more money to Scotland would have meant a greater reduction across the rest of the UK. And just to put this in context, if he objects to that approach, can I just point out, when it comes to structural funds, regions are allocated funds according to a Commission formula, which was agreed as part of the MF deal. MFF deal. This takes into account, among other factors, regional wealth relative to the EU average. As a result of the new EU formula for allocating structural funds, there would not have been a fair distribution across the UK, with each of the devolved administrations set out to lose out significantly. In 2013, the government therefore decided to correct this. As a result of Northern Ireland's allocation was increased by €181 million, Scotland's by €228 million, and Wales by €375 million. This means that all parts of the UK are subject to an equal cut. And we believe that that delivers the fairest deal for England, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Now, that equal treatment, which benefited Scotland, was not one that the Right Honourable Member chose to draw attention to the House on that point.
And the Minister, quite seriously, he'd probably get more information from the Scottish farmer than he's getting from his civil service briefs. There was €220 million of convergence money to take account of the fact that per hectare, particularly in Scotland, we were receiving so much less than the minimum allocated to other countries. Now, the question is quite a simple one. The vast majority of people think it would have been fair to distribute that per hectare. That's why we were getting the convergence funding. Why wasn't that done? And will the Minister revisit that bad decision?
Well, I make the point again, and I really do think he has to look at the overall treatment when we look at both the agricultural spending and the structural funds. There has been fair treatment with each part of the United Kingdom to ensure that no one part suffers as a result of changes to the EU budget. And I would make the point to him that if we can find savings in the common agricultural policy, then we should do so. Mr Williams, we have had a wide-ranging debate. When it comes down to it, I believe there is support for the clauses within the bill, but it does appear that the opposition wish to press their clauses, calling for us to write letters, calling for action, ignoring the fact that this action is already happening, that there is already going to be a review by the Council of Ministers of the MFF. The fact is that the Commission is already following the Prime Minister's historic deal, focusing on prioritising expenditure. That I'm afraid the letters that they propose will achieve nothing of any substance, and indeed don't really belong in a bill that is focused upon revenue rather than expenditure. So I would urge the Honourable Member for Worsley and Eccles South to withdraw amendments and urge Honourable Members to support the clauses in the bill.
The question is that clause 1 stand parts of the bill. As many as that's opinion say aye. Aye. Contrary no. I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. We now come to Amendment 1. I call Barbara Keeley to move formally.
Formally.
The question is that the amendments be made. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no. 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 Division. The question is that the amendment be made. As many as that's opinion say aye. Aye. And contrary, no.
No.
Tells for the ayes Tom Blenkinsop and Graham Jones. Tell us for the no Simon Kirby and Mel Stride.
Right, thank you.
Lock the doors. Order.
The ayes to the right, 254. The noes to the left, 301.
The ayes to the right, 254. The noes to the left, 301. So the noes have it. The noes have it. Order.
Unlock.
Unlock. The question is that Clause 2 stand parts of the bill as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. Will the contrary no? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. The question is that I do report to the bill to the House without amendments as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary no? I think the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Order. Order.
Thanks for that. Chaps, enjoy Groundhog Day.
Order. Order. Third reading. Now, the question is that the bill no be read a third time. Aye. Aye. You want to carry on? Minister.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. And I beg that the European Union Finance Bill be now read a third time. The bill before us gives UK approval to the financing aspects of the 2013 EU budget deal. As honourable members will recall, in 2013 the Prime Minister secured a deal that delivered the first ever real terms cut to the EU budget and preserved our rebate. If we are tightening our belts at home, we should not be spending more through the European Union, and we are not, thanks to the Prime Minister's historic deal. It's a good deal for the taxpayer now and over the coming years. In addition to forcing restraint on EU expenditure, on the revenue side, it was a specific objective for the UK that there would be no new types of member state contribution, no new EU-wide taxes to finance EU spending, and no change to the UK rebate. This is precisely what we achieved. The political agreement at the 2013 February European Council was accurately reflected in the new Own Resources Decision, or ORD for short. This sets out the system of financing the EU budget until 2020 and was agreed unanimously by Member States at a meeting of the Council of Ministers in May 2014. Honourable members will have noted that the ORD reintroduces reductions in the GNI-based contributions of the Netherlands and Sweden and introduces small reductions in these contributions for Denmark and Austria. The UK will contribute to these small corrections, but this will largely be offset by changes to other corrections. The UK has always supported the principle of budgetary corrections set out at the 1984 Fontainebleau European Council, which gave us our own rebate. In the absence of any meaningful reform on the expenditure side of the EU budget, we believe that those member states, like the UK, that make disproportionately large net contributions in relation to their prosperity should receive corrections. The bill before us will give UK approval to the unanimous agreement on the new ORD, an agreement that maintains the existing system of financing the EU budget. That means no new types of member state contributions, no new EU-wide taxes to finance EU spending, and crucially, no change to our rebate. Mr Deputy Speaker, this agreement is in our national interest. It also serves as an important reminder of what can be done when we are tough, constructive, positive and determined in negotiations with European partners. And Mr Deputy Speaker, the agreement that will be implemented by this bill is a good deal for Britain and a good deal for Europe, and I commend it to the House.
The question is that the bill now be read a third time. Barbara Keeley.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker, and I'm glad that new clauses 1 and 2 were discussed earlier. And given what happened in the vote just now, I urge the Minister to consider the importance of keeping the EU budget spending under review. The points I made earlier, the system of commitments and payments is concerning. We do want to make sure that we have a system of budgetary control, not a system that drives up the pressure for increases through unpaid bills and commitments made in years past, and I think that is an ongoing concern. I also urge the Minister to keep a focus on the need for reform of EU budget priorities, which we spent some time on, and particularly the need to increase funding for competitiveness for jobs and growth. I think it's important that government ministers have the ability to reshape EU budget priorities, and I'm not convinced from what we've discussed in this bill that we do. The Minister resisted our amendments and resisted making quite a sensible undertaking that would have meant we didn't have to have a vote on the bill. His position on our amendments really suggests that he is content with the reports and reviews trundling ahead in the EU, and it doesn't send the strong message that could be sent about the need for enhanced scrutiny and the need for reform of priorities. That is a pity, and I hope the Minister will continue to reflect on it.
Alexa.
Thank you, Mr Deputy Speaker. I rise just on the third reading to say if I think all of the way back to the committee stages of this bill, I do recall that the Minister didn't feel able to give an effective answer to the question about the Prime Minister's negotiating stance with the forthcoming European question, and particularly with regard to the finances. He was asked a number of times by both myself and other members by the Labour front bench what was going to be distinctive and what were the precise objectives of the Prime Minister. He answered in the committee stage by telling us that the government's objective was to minimise the EU budget, to make sure it was efficient, to protect the rebate. But that has been government policy for a number of years. What the House were really interested in was whether there was a specific intent and negotiating stance by the Prime Minister, what were his objectives, and we were interested in that question in terms of European finances so that we could judge his success or failure after the negotiations. And if the Minister, in summing up, doesn't feel able to provide an answer to what seems to me a very reasonable and fair question, then he's going to add and fuel suspicions among both pro and anti-European members in this House that it's not a question of the Prime Minister having a stance. It's the Prime Minister is deliberately, and the Government is deliberately concealing from the House and from the country what that stance is, so as they won't be able to be effectively judged when the negotiations are over. And that seems to me a fundamentally unsatisfactory way to proceed on any finances, never mind an issue as important as European finance. Well, the member on the Treasury bench shakes his head. I hope if he's going to disagree, he might want to intervene and perhaps reveal to us all what the Prime Minister's stance actually is, because all of us, and from many stances, are totally mystified by what these targets are in terms of the negotiations that are taking place around European capitals at the present moment. On our behalf and at our expense, the Prime Minister is moving from capital to capital, and the only people who are not to be told and informed about what his actual negotiating posture is are members of this House and the people of this country. It seems a remarkable position. So perhaps the Minister, and I know that his steady hand at the dispatch box, his wonderful cover drive, I know that he wouldn't, at the very last minute in this bill, want to be caught at slips in terms of not answering a simple question: what are the Prime Minister's negotiating targets, and how will we be able to judge whether he has achieved them or not?
The question is that the bill now be read a third time. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no. The ayes have it. The ayes.